Order, please. Order, please. Just before we get on with the daily routine, I'll present the Speaker's ruling on the point of privilege from last week. On September 26, the Honourable House Leader of the official opposition rose on a point of privilege. He stated that the government majority on the Public Accounts Committee had passed a motion to fundamentally change and circumscribe the mandate of Public Accounts Committee, and that this was contrary to Rule 85 of the Convention of this House respecting the requirement for a two-thirds majority to change the rules, our rules, and forms of procedure. There have been numerous rulings of previous speakers holding that a breach of the rules or usages of this House in committees cannot be raised by a member as a breach of privilege. Only in the most extreme and exceptional cases of a breach of privilege will a speaker become involved in anything occurring in a committee without a report coming to the House from the committee. Otherwise, only a report from the committee itself can bring such an issue to this House. I refer the members to the extensive review of this principle set out in the ruling of Speaker Goss delivered on November the 8th, 2012. Accordingly, there is no point of privilege. While that disposes of the point raised by the Honourable House Leader, I want to add a further comment because the objection was framed as a change to the House rules having been made by a committee rather than a two-thirds vote of the House itself. That is, the mandate of the Public Accounts Committee set out in Rule 60 had been changed. This was not the case. The motion that was passed by the committee reads, quote, all agenda items for the Public Accounts Committee be set through the Auditor General reports beginning with the May 29, 2018 performance report and future agenda sequences for scheduling to follow, the order of chapters for each subsequent report tabled by the Auditor General with the appropriate department witnesses, end quote. This was simply a motion to establish the agenda items for the committee within the mandate of the committee. It does remain open to the committee to adopt other agenda items in the future, and nothing precludes any member of that committee from proposing motions for other agenda items. I have only addressed this because I wanted to bring clarity to the point that the rules and forms of procedures have not been changed and that the Public Accounts Committee mandate remained the same. Also, just before we begin with the daily routine, on another matter, I'd like to bring everybody's attention that on this date in 1758, some 260 years ago, the House of Assembly met for the first time in the courthouse at the corner of Argyle and Buckingham Streets in Halifax. In 1765, it moved to a building on the corner of Barrington and Sackville Streets, and then to rented quarters in the Cochrane Building on Hollis Street. After a succession of temporary accommodations, construction began on a permanent building in 1811, and the legislature met for the first time on February 11, 1819, in this newly completed Province House. In a few short months, we will celebrate the 200th anniversary of this fine edifice. Province House is one of the most historic buildings in Canada and is also considered to be the finest example of British Palladian architecture in the country. During the 175th anniversary in 1994, Province House was commemorated as a National Historic Site in the presence of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, and was cited for both its architectural and historical significance. Province House holds an important place in our nation's history. It is the oldest legislative building in the country, and a number of Canadian firsts have occurred within these walls. We were the first to achieve responsible government in the British Overseas Empire, and in 1835, Joseph Howe made his renowned speech before the Supreme Court in what is now the Legislative Library. His acquittal marked the beginnings of freedom of the press in Canada. I'm pleased to advise this House that plans are well underway to observe the anniversary next year. This milestone occasion will be marked with a ceremony in the Assembly Chamber on February 11th, 2019, and a program of public events and activities are being organized throughout the year. The Legislative Library is currently doing a 200-day countdown and is tweeting a fact a day about Province House leading up to our anniversary day. There are a number of citizenship ceremonies being planned along with a concert series in the Red Chamber. We will partner with Symphony Nova Scotia, and a new fanfare composition will premiere at their February 7th concert. In July, the House of Assembly will host the 57th Annual Canadian Regional Conference for the Commonwealth, Parliamentary Association. This is the House of the People, and we encourage everyone to take part in the celebrations. The primary objective and incentive is to appropriately celebrate the bicentennial of the most important public building in Nova Scotia, and to instill a sense of pride and citizenship in Nova Scotians, and to encourage and increase visitation, especially during the summer months. In light of this momentous occasion, we have developed a new logo, and it is an honor to reveal it to the members today. I'm pleased to announce to the House that Etta Moffat, an accomplished graphic designer with Communications Nova Scotia, had created the image. Unfortunately, Etta is unable to join us today, but I would ask that the honourable members show their appreciation for her wonderful work. The logo represents the building and its wealth of architecture and unique details. The circular window from the pediment on the west side of the building is where the logo draws its inspiration. It presents a pattern and shape that you will see throughout the house. The circular shape implies movement, openness, and unity. It is a symbol of eternity and celebrates the longevity of Province House. The window represents a place for looking inward and outward, and it is a place to look and see a province that is moving in a positive direction, and an opportunity to look in and see our impressive past. A calcine font was used in Joseph Howe's newspaper, The Nova Scotian, in the 1840s. And the blue is based on a historic color from that period. Great effort has been made in recent years to protect and maintain Province House as the symbolic home of all Nova Scotians. The anniversary will emphasize its role in constitutional evolution of Canada, its rich history and unique architecture, and its continuity as the seat of government and an important cultural asset to our province. Province House has been the scene for landmark moments in the life of the province. It is a place where all Nova Scotians are represented, and it is a place where we honor and recognize the outstanding citizens, and it is the place where we recognize and welcome our distinguished guests. I encourage all members of this House to support the project with your participation at various events and to promote it amongst your constituencies. Thank you very much. And I would be remiss just before we get to the fine member to offer a word of thanks to the manager of this House, Mike Laffin, and Peter Terrio for all of their work. Mike and Peter put a lot of time and effort and clearly have a passion for this particular building and the institution that is Province House, and we as members have the privilege of working with them every day and working in this building that they work so hard to maintain and to sustain for the next couple of 100 years. So thank you very much, Michael and Peter. Appreciate it. Well, now, just before we move on with the daily routine, the Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I understand we can't appeal a decision of yourself on the issue that my colleague brought to the floor last week about Public Accounts Committee. But the question is, Mr. Speaker, as a member of the Public Accounts Committee myself, very challenging to bring forward a report from the committee if the criticism or the trouble the opposition has is with the majority of the government members that make up that committee. How in the world are we supposed to bring a report to yourself when the government members will vote that down? It's a challenge to be on that committee, Mr. Speaker, and represent the best interests of Nova Scotians.
I'll take your point under advisement and I'll get back to you. We'll now get on with the daily routine. Beginning with presenting and reading of petitions. Presenting reports of committees, the Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as Chair of the Committee on Law Amendments, I'm directed to report that the committee has met and considered the following bills. Bill number 39, an act to amend Chapter 62 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Cemetery and Funeral Services Act, and Chapter 144 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Embalmers and Funeral Directors Act. Bill number 49, an act to amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Gaming Control Act. Bill number 51, an act to amend Chapter 8 of the Act of 2014, the Halifax Convention Centre Act. Bill number 55, an act to incorporate the Region of Windsor and West Hants Municipality. Bill number 58, an act to amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act, and Chapter 39 of the Acts of 2008, the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter. Bill number 63, an act to repeal Chapter 7 of the Acts of 2015, the Nova Scotia Provincial Exhibition Commission Act. And Bill number 67, an act to amend Chapter 418 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Securities Act. Mr. Speaker, the committee recommends these bills to the favourable consideration of the House without amendments.
Ordered that these bills be referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Bills. We'll now move on to tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. As Speaker of the House of Assembly and pursuant to Section 18 of the Auditor General Act, I'm pleased to table the report of the Auditor General Financial, October 2018. The report is tabled. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to move this on behalf of the Premier. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October is Women's History Month in Canada, and this year's theme is Make an Impact in honour of the women and girls who have made a lasting impact as pioneers in their fields. And whereas as business leaders, politicians, researchers, artists, activists, and more, women have made Nova Scotia and Canada thriving, diverse and prosperous regions through their achievements and desire to make a difference. And whereas 2018 marks 100 years since the beginning of the right to vote for women in Nova Scotia and the right of women to run for elected office, momentous events that are important to our history and continue to shape our future. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of the House of Assembly recognize October as Women's History Month and honour the important and lasting impact of women making a difference across Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I beg leave to make an introduction?
Permission granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to draw the attention of members to the East Gallery, where I'd like to introduce two special guests from the IWK. Anne Yule, the Interim Vice President of Patient Care, and Michelle Ledrew, the Director of Women's and Newborn Health Program. I'd like to ask the House to join me in giving our guests a warm welcome and extend our gratitude on behalf of all Nova Scotians.
Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Baby Friendly Initiative, BFI, is a global quality improvement program of UNICEF and the World Health Organization, which sets out standards so that parents are enabled and supported to meet infant feeding goals, and whereas BFI supports families to make informed decisions and benefit from evidence-based care such as skin-to-skin contact immediately after birth, keeping moms and babies together and supplementing feedings when it is medically appropriate to do so. And whereas the IWK Health Centre received official BFI designation in mid-July 2018, the first health centre in the Maritimes to do so, and one of less than 20 hospitals in Canada to have this designation. Therefore be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly acknowledge this as a monumental achievement for the IWK and Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate. There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October is Car Safety Month across Canada, and whereas proper safety precautions, including routine maintenance and the installation of winter tires, can help reduce accidents and save lives, and whereas the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal takes its mission to provide safe roads seriously, therefore be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly recognize the importance of Car Safety Month in Canada and work to ensure a safe winter driving season for all Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Seniors.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
Thank you. If each of these would rise when I introduce them. John Hamblin with Aging 2.0, Startup Canada. Ian McDonald, Seniors Advisory Council. Betty McDonald, Federation of Nova Scotia Municipalities. Bernard Conrad, Seniors Advisory Council. Krista Connell, Nova Scotia Health Research Foundation. Marjorie Willison, Co-Chair, Advisory Committee. Bill Berryman, Seniors Advisory Council. Michelle Langell, Seniors Advisory Council. Peter Kerr and Ron Swain, both with Seniors Advisory Council. And I believe we have the Deputy Minister, D'Entremont, and staff here as well. So, Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this week we recognize Seniors Week and the endless efforts of older Nova Scotians. And whereas we commend these older Nova Scotians and their commitment to serving our communities as leaders, volunteers, and caregivers to others. And whereas we would like to acknowledge, value, promote, and support older Nova Scotians who contribute, preserve, and share a wealth of knowledge to their communities. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House acknowledge the commitment and dedication of Nova Scotia's older adults to ensuring our province continues to thrive. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make an introduction. However, the people that I'd like to introduce are stuck downstairs due to capacity issues, so I'd like to still read the introduction if I may. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce three young workers. There's Kadeem Hinch, Curtis Wiley, and Lewis Pope. They've all been doing some excellent work for the province, and we thank them for choosing us as a place to build their career. We hope our first career fair today attracts more younger workers like them to join the Public Service Commission. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas today the provincial government hosted the first ever career fair where the public service was showcased as an employer to university and community college students. And whereas the province of Nova Scotia is committed to attracting and retaining younger workers, and whereas the government is focused on hiring more young workers and students and have removed barriers like unnecessary experience requirements in job postings. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly recognize and commend the hard work, dedication, and to further move on with all the work that the young people are doing, and wish them all the best in participating in this event. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. It is agreed. Will all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to make an introduction before reading my resolution.
Permission granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw my colleagues' attention to the Speaker's Gallery, where we're joined today by a Ukrainian delegation who are on a mission to Canada to learn more about how our judicial system handles public communications. The delegation is made up of judge speakers, court press secretaries, representatives of justice sector institutions, as well as legal reporters. And I'd like to introduce our delegates, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Myrna Shiliak, Chief Justice of the Economic Court of Ivano-Frankish Region. Alexander Strachuk, Prosecutor of the Ivano-Frankish Region. Maria Gavriluk, Deputy Editor-in-Chief of the KURS website. Nina Lvova, Head of Legal Department, Regional Branch of the Department of State Judicial Administration of the Odessa Region. Olena Ovchinnikova, Director of Odessa Media News Agency. Karina Aslanian, Communications Advisor to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Natalia Horodetsky, Senior Manager of International Programs, Office of the Commissioner for Federal Judicial Affairs in Canada. And they're joined today by Jennifer Stairs, our Communications Director with the Executive Office of the Nova Scotia Judiciary. Mr. Speaker, I ask that members join me in giving them a warm welcome to this historic chamber, to Nova Scotia and to Canada.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Office of the Commissioner for Federal Judicial Affairs Canada and the National Judicial Institute have collaborated over a number of years to bring this delegation from Ukraine to better understand and learn from Canada's approach to the public communications by the judiciary, the courts, and other institutions working in the legal system. And whereas Nova Scotia's courts are highly regarded for being open and transparent through collegial relationships, strong partnerships, and effective two-way communications with advocates, the media, and the public on justice-related matters. And whereas the Ukrainian delegation is seeking to develop effective communication processes and channels so that they may enhance legal awareness, establish a working relationship between judges and journalists, and improve public confidence in the judiciary and the Ukrainian courts. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate our friends from Ukraine and the Nova Scotia Judiciary, led by Chief Justice Michael MacDonald, for their combined efforts to advance public education, to strengthen the understanding of court decisions, and transparency of justice in their country. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? Agreed. It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mark Davies, a farmer in the Annapolis Valley, recently stepped down after serving more than a decade as the chair of the Turkey Farmers of Canada. And whereas Mr. Davies specializes in raising turkeys and supporting the industry's effort to expand this market with further processing as a key growth area. Whereas Mr. Davies has been active with provincial, national, and international bodies who recognize the strong contribution to the development of Nova Scotia's agriculture community. Therefore, we resolve that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Mark Davies on his success as a family farmer, a business and marketing innovator, and a leader in the agricultural community. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for a request for waiver of notice and pass without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? It is agreed. With all those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried. We'll now move on to introduction of bills. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 246 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Labour Standards Code, to stimulate the economy and reduce income inequality.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 246 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Labour Standards Code, to stimulate the economy and reduce income inequality.
Bill number 77, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 246 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Labour Standards Code, to stimulate the economy and reduce income inequality.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to acknowledge that we are standing on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia. And in that spirit, I would like to table a bill entitled An Act to Implement the Calls to Action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Implement the Calls to Action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada.
Bill number 78, entitled An Act to Implement the Calls to Action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. We'll now move on to notices of motion. Statements by members. The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, We Walk for Water Day was held April 27th at the DeCoste Centre in Pictou. Students from local schools gathered together to participate in the rally, which coincides with others that take place across Canada, the United States, and Europe. We Walk for Water Day celebrates what these students have been doing, such as volunteering and fundraising, to deliver clean, safe, and accessible drinking water to those that go without it. There was also a water walk, which had students from each school carry water for a distance to demonstrate what people throughout the world face to have access to safe drinking water. It was truly a wonderful sight to see so many young people come together, bond, and educate each other on this important issue. I want to extend a sincere thank you to all the organizers and participants in the We Walk for Water Day activities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to make some introductions.
Permission granted.
On this very busy day in the House, I'd like to draw the members' attention to the West Gallery, where it's my privilege to introduce some of the medalists of the Pan American Canoe Championships and Olympic Hopes Regatta held on Lake Banook last month. And I'd ask each of the athletes to stand as I read their name and then accept the warm welcome of the House. Julia Lily Osende, Geneva Bond, Jessica McKay, Connor Fitzpatrick, Marley McIntosh, also recent gold medalist at the World Marathon Games, Craig Johnson, Ava Carew, Ian Gaudette, Alex Canning, Lily Bart, Anna O'Brien, David Waters, Tyler Laidlaw, who I got to give a medal to, Karita Thomas, and Claire Brothers, and coaches and parents and grandparents, thank you so much for joining us in the House today.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, last month, Dartmouth's Lickbanook played host to the 2018 Pan American Canoe Sprint and Para-Canoe Championships. The event boasted over 350 athletes from more than 16 countries who competed in several canoe and kayak races. I rise today to congratulate the athletes and the organizers on such a successful event. We are so pleased, I am so pleased that so many of these fine and dedicated Dartmouth athletes representing several clubs, including Sonobe, Masqua, and Bannock, are able to join us in the legislature today. One does not get to such a level of sport without an immense amount of hard work, dedication, and community and family support. I ask all members of this House to join me once again in congratulating these amazing athletes and to wish them all the best in their future competitions.
The honourable member for Clare Digby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to welcome Constable Frederick Mubiru to our area. As elsewhere in our province, we want people to make our communities their new home. They may arrive as strangers, but quickly become our friends and part of our community. Constable Mubiru grew up a long way from Digby, growing up in Uganda and arriving in Canada 10 years ago as a refugee. For Frederick, becoming a police officer was only a distant dream until he immigrated to Canada. Then he was determined to become an RCMP officer. He returned to school, became an associate professor at his church, and organized an association to support youth and immigrants. He was accepted at the RCMP Academy and graduated at the top of his class, receiving the highest score in applied police service. He also became the first person of Ugandan descent to graduate from the Academy. In addition to this education, Constable Mubiru brings to the area his unique perspective and enthusiasm for helping others. He exemplifies that when you have a positive attitude, you are willing to work for your goals, positive things will happen to you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I would like to recognize our Eastern Passage and Area Business Association. After holding their first annual general meeting in August of 2018, our new board members are as follows. Our President, Tamara Freeman, Vice President, Magali Gregor, Treasurer Jody Wood-Kaiser, Secretary Magali Gregor, Social Media Director Chris Peters, Ethics Chair Marilyn Martineau, and too many members to list. I would like to congratulate Tamara Freeman and the entire Eastern Passage Business Association on such an outstanding first year. Our first annual Business Expo was held last season, and it was a great success. Events such as these and the ones that require a lot of helping hands also bring together our nonprofit and service sector organizations, and we are uniting as a community. The EPABA was formed to promote, grow, and support Eastern Passage and area businesses, and we want to thank all of the members of the group and wish them another year of success. Thank you.
The honourable member for Guysborough Eastern Shore Tracadie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
Mr. Speaker, I'd ask the members of the House to cast their gaze to the East Gallery, where we have some important members of the historic Sherbrooke Village joining us today, and I'd ask that they stand as I read their names and accept the warm welcome of the House. We have animator Lynn Hain, animator Terry MacDonald, and Terry, I might mention, is the current president of the Temperance Society of Historic Sherbrooke Village, and is here on the spot prepared to accept pledges from all members on all sides of the House today, and she's very serious about her mission in life. And animator Anthony Huntley, he's a blacksmith at the historic Sherbrooke Village. Board member Clarence Humber, board member Neil Black, and the executive director of historic Sherbrooke Village, and perhaps the best animator of all, Mr. Stephen Fleming. So I'd ask the House to give him a warm welcome.
The honourable member for Guysborough Eastern Shore, Tracadie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in recognition of Lynn Hayne, Terry McDonald, and Anthony Huntley. These fine folks are the recipients of the Sherbrooke Village Restoration Commission Awards of Excellence for 2018. These awards recognize excellence in leadership, profession, innovation, and creativity by the Sherbrooke Village staff. Lynn received the Innovation and Creativity Award of Excellence for developing and delivering new programs that significantly enhanced the visitor experience. Terry received the Leadership Award of Excellence for her commitment to fostering quality work through a supportive team environment and demonstrating exemplary relationship building. Tony took home the Award of Excellence in Profession for motivating and inspiring others through his professionalism and his high skill level as the village blacksmith. Mr. Speaker, I invite all members to join me in congratulating and thanking these three outstanding employees of historic Sherbrooke Village for their strong contribution to Nova Scotia tourism. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I want to pay homage to a band that was known throughout Colchester County and indeed the province throughout the 1960s. The Lincolns, a cover band like none other, dug deeper than the top 40 of the day into the very roots of rock music. Regular venues included Shorts Lake, Brule Beach, and the Legion in Truro. Rod Norrie, the only surviving member of the original four, and Frank McKay, whose voice itself was legendary, are two of the 9 former band members who will participate in final comeback performances. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in thanking the members of the Lincolns, past and present, for the music they have shared with us for so long. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Friends of the Northumberland Strait have recruited reinforcements to fight Northern Pulp's plan to pump millions of litres of effluent into the Northumberland Strait. Lawyer James Gunvaldson Klassen of Eco-Justice recently opened an Atlantic office. He and fellow Eco-Justice lawyer Sarah MacDonald will be providing legal support for the Friends group. They believe there is a conflict of interest on the part of the Nova Scotia government and that government is just too close to the Northern Pulp project. Eco-Justice has 5 offices across Canada and use their years of knowledge to defend nature, combat climate change, and fight for a healthy environment. And that's why more and more Nova Scotians are joining the No Pipe movement. Thank you.
The honourable member for Halifax, Armdale.
Mr. Speaker, on September 23rd, I had the privilege to help pay tribute to some of our city's history at Mount Olivet Cemetery in my Armdale constituency. There I was joined by Nova Scotians and people from across Canada and the globe, including honorary consuls of Lebanon from Alberta, Nova Scotia, and British Columbia. His Beatitude Cardinal Rai from Lebanon, Bishop Tabbitt from Montreal, and many others, including the Titanic Society of Atlantic Canada, to plant a cedar tree, the well-known symbol of Lebanon, in commemoration of the souls of the Lebanese who perished with RMS Titanic in 1912. I was touched to see our communities gathering to remember the victims of this historic event, and I hope the cedar tree and the plaque accompanying it will help illuminate our shared history for all those who wish to visit Mount Olivet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize my CA back home in Cumberland South. Ever since my election, she has guided me through her seasoned position through the ways and means of how to get here today so we could all stand here. As we all know, we all have CAs back home that guide us through, but today is a special day for Karen Barkley, and I would like to recognize her and say happy birthday to Karen Barkley today. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Lunenburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to congratulate Chip Dickinson of Mahone Bay on his recent retirement from the Nova Scotia Boat Builders Association. Chip has been with the Nova Scotia Boat Builders Association for the past 14 years and has made considerable contributions to the industry. He played an integral role in establishing the boat builder and marine service technicians trades and related apprenticeships. Tim Edwards, the Executive Director of the NSBA, presented Chip with a plaque commemorating his service and acknowledging his dedication to the boat building industry. Mr. Speaker, I would ask that you and all members of this House of Assembly please join me in congratulating Chip for his contributions to the Nova Scotia Boat Builders Association over the past 14 years and congratulate him on his recent retirement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, Monday, October the 1st, the Sackville Heights Junior High School once again participated in this year's annual Terry Fox Run. Mr. Speaker, according to the Canadian Cancer Society, the incidences of cancer in Nova Scotian men are 8 times higher than in Nova Scotia, and in Nova Scotian women 4% than the Canada average. There isn't a single Nova Scotian who has not been touched by this disease. I wanted to rise today to congratulate the staff and the students who at present have raised over $1,000, and I know donations are still coming in, for their efforts of helping to beat this terrible disease and for helping to keep Terry Fox's dream alive. Mr. Speaker, once again, I want to thank all those who've participated in this worthwhile cause yesterday at SHJH. Thank you.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the weekend, I was pleased to take part in a Truro's Ride for Refuge, which highlighted sobering statistics and facts about human trafficking in Nova Scotia, and particularly in Truro. Signs were placed on fountains in Truro, as well as a 10-kilometer span around, and the signs targeted human trafficking. Ride for Refuge is a national fundraiser where participants have the choice to walk or bike to raise funds for the victims of human trafficking. And it was noted that by a number of women that this is another reason why Truro needs a sane program very much, because human trafficking with girls needing help is becoming a huge deal in Truro. All donations will go to the Trauma Recover for Exploited Youth, an organization dedicated to helping and housing victims of human trafficking. So congratulations to the McLeods for running this important program. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask that I can make that introduction now, that I have the workers up. Okay. As I've mentioned earlier, I have 3 workers that are working with the public service, young workers that are doing a great job. Kadeem Hinch, Curtis Wiley, and Lewis Pope. If all 3 of you could stand up and receive a welcome from the House. Thank you.
The honourable member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to recognize Giant Steps Children's Centre in Upper Tantallon. On June 19th, Giant Steps Children's Centre reached a special milestone when Cooper Nicholas graduated as their 1,000th student. The school, in partnership with parents, strives to create a warm, friendly, and respectful environment for children taking their first steps to gain some independence from their parents. Under the care of a supportive staff, children are introduced to an educational component that is the start of their academic journey. The school graduates about 85 students every spring and plays an important role for families in the community as they care and guide our children. I would like the members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly to join me in congratulating the wonderful success of this business and their 1,000th student, Cooper Nicholas. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on Sunday, September 30th, I had the opportunity to attend and drop the puck at Centre Ice for the home opener of the South Shore Major Bantam Lumberjacks, formerly known as the Western Hurricanes. This is the 9th season opener of Major Bantam hockey at our home, Queen's Place Emera Centre. The South Shore Lumberjacks Major Bantam program draws players from all along the South Shore, from Halifax to Yarmouth, and they've become the weekend entertainment for many fans. Coaches Sean Woodworth, Adam Maslin, Jeremy Keeney, and Keegan Watt offer coaching at a competitive level, emphasizing on education, skill development, and sportsmanship. Donna Coleman is always on hand as trainer, and Will and Austin Baker bring the game to another level with music and announcing. I ask all members of this House to join me in wishing the South Shore Major Bantam Lumberjacks a great 2018-19 season. Go Jacks. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Fairview Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Feed Nova Scotia as it expands its headquarters to a new location in Burnside. Formerly located on the Bedford Highway for close to 2 decades, the organization was able to double the amount of food distributed to those in need. Feed Nova Scotia saw a need for a larger space to be able to provide not just non-perishable items, but also fresh fruits and vegetables, meats, and other healthy products. In the last year alone, Feed Nova Scotia delivered 2 million kilograms of food, with 55% being fresh produce. Each day, the organization distributes roughly 10,000 kilograms of food. However, with this new facility, they will be able to increase their donations and therefore distribute even more. We will greatly miss the staff and volunteers at Feed Nova Scotia, but know that they will continue to do amazing things in their new home. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the members of this House join me in wishing Feed Nova Scotia the best of luck in their new facility. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to wish Alec and Valerie Pendergrass every success with their new adventure, Treasures on the Waterfront. The couple who lived in Halifax and loved to shop in high-end consignment shops decided to open their own shop on Commercial Street in North Sydney. The shop is solely focused on top brands that are not common in Cape Breton. In addition to women's clothing, shoes and accessories, they plan to expand into children's and men's lines as well. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate the Pendergrass on their official opening and wishing them many years of success. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to commend the fine work done by Community Wheels, a barrier-free, community-based transportation option for residents of the primarily rural area of the municipality of Chester in Lunenburg County. The service is available to all residents of the community who require transportation to, among other things, medical appointments, banking, grocery shopping, access to employment opportunities, recreation, and socialization. There is no charge, only a free will offering. Community Wheels also operates a charter service to earn additional revenue. Funding from government transportation and accessibility programs to support projects like Community Wheels are essential in rural areas of Nova Scotia so that Nova Scotians can stay involved in and connected to their communities and good jobs. Mr. Speaker, I ask the members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly to join me in congratulating the excellent work being done by Community Wheels and to wish them well in their future endeavours. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, Diego Marshall of Bododig First Nation in Cape Breton Richmond was named a team member of Team Nova Scotia Nunavut and participated in the 2018 Royal Canadian Legion National Youth Track and Field Championships in Brandon, Manitoba in August of 2018. Diego left for nationals on a high note, having already won gold medals in both high and long jump at the Atlantic Outdoor Track and Field Championships held in Charlottetown in July 2018. Diego won a bronze medal for the U16 high jump during the competition. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I would like to extend my congratulations to Diego on his many accomplishments and to wish him good luck in future endeavours. Walalan, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Lunenburg.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Cheryl Lamerson, who owns and operates the Lunenburg Community Consignment. Lunenburg Community Consignment is not your ordinary consignment store, as its profits go back to charities in the community. From each item sold, 50% of the profits go to the consignor, 30% towards the operating expenses, and the remaining 20% goes to a charity. The store is run by volunteers who identify a charity they wish to support, and the money is given to the charity of choice based on how many hours the volunteer has worked. Cheryl has always wanted to own an antique store and felt this was a great opportunity to sell gently used items and antiques while giving back to the community. Mr. Speaker, I would ask that you and the members of this House of Assembly please join me in recognizing Cheryl for her contributions to the community and wish Lunenburg Community Consignment all the success in the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize Burke Bede of the Amherst Little League team Casey Concrete Mixers. Burke pitched a no-hitter in the Amherst Little League playoffs. He struck out 17 batters without giving up any hits or walks. Burke showed great skill in his tournament, and his hard work was a big help to his fellow teammates. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to commend Burke Bede and wish him success in his athletic career. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Clayton Park West.
Mr. Speaker, on Women's History Month, I would like to recognise a young woman from my riding who raises awareness about global causes. Fiona Forsyth is a student at Fairview Junior High. She is a member of WE, an organisation that empowers people by offering resources to help create positive social change in their community and around the world. Fiona has written over 30 letters for Amnesty International's Right for Rights campaign and works with Project ARC, a show put on by a youth cast to teach children about human rights violations around the world. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the members of the House of Assembly join me in celebrating Fiona's many contributions. She's an exemplary role model for all her peers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question's for the Premier. Yesterday, 3 witnesses appeared before the Standing Committee on Law Amendments to support a government bill. What was unusual, Mr. Speaker, was that the trio came from out of province, from Ontario and BC, and on the taxpayers' dime. John Kelly, former CEO for the Responsible Gaming Council, CEO Jamie Webb, and the Council's ex-Director of Research and Development, and Sue Burge, Director of Standards and Accreditation for the Council, all travelled to Halifax for their 10-minute appearance before the committee, and all at the invitation of this government and at the expense of hard-working Nova Scotians. We'd like to know, Mr. Speaker, how much did it cost taxpayers to fly these 3 witnesses to Halifax to act as government cheerleaders?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. Mr. Speaker, I too, she raises concerns that I too have with the gaming corporations. Not the fact that they've gone out and looked for expertise advice, Mr. Speaker, to bring together public policy, but the fact that when it comes to standing before a committee in this province, no one should be paid before that. She's absolutely right. There are hardworking Nova Scotians who continue day after day, community either supporting a piece of legislation or oppose it. I want to assure the honourable member that when that was heard, the minister responsible, the Minister of Finance, contacted her deputy. The word has gone to Gaming Corp that we expect them to find the cost of bringing them to this province within inside of their operations, not impacting what the impact it would have to revenue to the people of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, and I thank the Premier for his answer. However, at the time when, there's not a doctor for 100,000 Nova Scotians, they're not happy that their hard-earned tax dollars, Mr. Speaker, has been used to pay witnesses at a committee to basically toe the Liberal Party line. And this is the second standing committee in the past 7 days that this government used in an unprecedented, disrespectful way. Opposition MLAs have lots of questions for witnesses at committee. Now we'll just have to ask the government who they paid to appear. So how often does the government pay the expenses of witnesses at committees or compensate them in some other way?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we do not. Mr. Speaker, I want to again say to the honourable member, it was the Gaming Corporation that moved to make that happen. When it was brought to our attention, we immediately said it's unacceptable. As I said, there are many times hardworking Nova Scotians from across this province come to this House, go to law amendments. I would say we're the only Canadian jurisdiction that actually still holds law amendments, which is an important part for the public process, to have them come in and express themselves. They do so at their own expense, and we expect witnesses who come in here who want to express their opinion in that form. They cover their own expenses, and we've made it very clear to the Gaming Corporation that we expect them define the cost of what it brought them inside of their own operation.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, it's unfortunate that someone's not watching their department clearly. Some estimates put the cost of bringing the 3 witnesses to committee at about $7,500. All 3 of them could have made a written submission for free. like many others. For some young people, Mr. Speaker, that's approaching the cost of a year at university. It wasn't very long ago that this government blocked Nova Scotians from speaking at law amendments. So the Premier can, say that people come and we're the only ones, but however, they blocked people from coming for Bill 148, 75 and 72. So I'd like to know, will the Premier commit today to reimbursing the taxpayers for the travel costs of their witnesses and to end the practice of paying witnesses to come to law amendments?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I apologize for answering the question, the first one she asked me, Mr. Speaker. She continues to ask the same question. The reality of it is I agree with her. Mr. Speaker, I agree with the position that no one should be paid to go before that committee, nor do I believe the Gaming Corp should have done that. And, Mr. Speaker, it should have been very clear that these were consultants that the Gaming Corp used around their public policy position. And the reality of it is, when we heard that, the ministers directed her deputy to go to the Gaming Corp to tell them that funding needs to be found inside of that organization.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Yesterday, with a scheduled change in Saskatchewan, we became in Nova Scotia the lowest minimum wage jurisdiction in the country. And there are now so many measures of consumer purchasing power where we're at the bottom. The worst consumer debt delinquency, the worst youth unemployment, the worst percentage of our population living on low income. And effective economic growth cannot possibly be advanced with purchasing power at this level. Will the Premier acknowledge that it is now time for Nova Scotia to join progressive jurisdictions in the march towards a minimum wage of $15?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. We continue, Mr. Speaker, to follow the practice of the former government when it came to their minimum wage committee. We continue to make those increases. I also want to tell him that when we had an opportunity to provide the single largest tax cut in the history of our province, we did so on the basic personal exemption so that it would impact and leave more money in the pockets of the very individuals that he's referring to. Continue to invest in rent supplements, Mr. Speaker, so we can afford affordable housing within inside of our province. And I want to update the honourable member that when they were in government, youth unemployment was about 19%. It's continued to go down. It's around 16%, Mr. Speaker. It's still too high, but we're moving in the right direction, and more young people are seeing a future for themselves in this province of ours.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, it is inappropriate economics to compare the benefits of a $15 minimum wage to the benefits that come from what the Premier is speaking about in a tax credit change. It is to compare hundreds with thousands. Yesterday was a big day on this front in Canada. Alberta moved to a $15 minimum wage. And did they do it? They did it over a 3-year phase-in. And during the 3 years while they moved to $15, what we did in Nova Scotia was fall to the basement on the minimum wage front with annual increases of 15 cents. Will the Premier give consideration to the fact that we cannot be labour market competitive in Nova Scotia as a 15-cent jurisdiction in a $15 world?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to again remind him, Mr. Speaker, they had an opportunity to make adjustments in the economic future of this province, Mr. Speaker. I think Nova Scotians spoke loud and clear when they saw what happened to the economy of this province under an NDP government. I want to assure the honourable member we take this issue very seriously. I want to also remind him our population is at an all-time high, Mr. Speaker, which means more people are moving into this province, Mr. Speaker, than leaving. I want to remind the honourable member under our leadership, Mr. Speaker, we continue to see more young people stay in this province than go, Mr. Speaker. Under their direction, Mr. Speaker, young people were leaving this province. They're now staying, investing, building a future for themselves. I want to remind the honourable member we just invested in a pre-primary program that helps, Mr. Speaker, every social economic disadvantaged family to have their 4-year-old in school, Mr. Speaker. That's an investment in the future of this province. We're going to continue to make public policy, Mr. Speaker, that makes sense for this province, not what makes sense for Alberta. We're going to continue to drive an economy and provide hope for our citizens.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
October 1st was also a big date on the calendar in that it marks the month in which we are going to come to the 6th year in which this government has been in power, at which point I would begin to think the government would think more about the present and the future than the Premier's analysis of the now fairly distant past. Look, an hour ago, there was a demonstration at the offices of the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education, following from a demonstration at Dalhousie for $15 an hour. Speakers there talked about the scandalous fact that today our minimum wage is not worth as much inflation adjusted as it was in 1977. I want to say plainly and without malice that, in my view, the Premier is providing terrible leadership in allowing our province to have the lowest minimum wage in the entire country. And I want to ask him if he will take advantage of the present moment to reverse this mistaken judgment.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm taking by that question the honourable member didn't vote for me. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is we laid a very different vision for this province, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, under their leadership, we saw no migration of young people. Under our leadership, young people see a future for themselves here in this province. I want to tell the honourable member, not only under their leadership, Mr. Speaker, population was stagnant, Mr. Speaker. Under our leadership, the population is growing, Mr. Speaker. I want to remind the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, that low-income families saw no hope of providing their 4-year-olds with a pre-primary program, evidence-based, Mr. Speaker. Under our leadership, Mr. Speaker, every social-economics disadvantaged child deserves the same thing as those who are doing well, Mr. Speaker. I want to continue to remind the honourable member the economy of this province is booming, Mr. Speaker. We're moving forward. People see hope, and no matter how much he wants to drag us into the past, we're looking to the future.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question's for the Premier. We remain shocked and dismayed by the government's imposed limits on the Public Accounts Committee. In reference to the Public Accounts Committee, the Premier has said to the media, I quote, "The Auditor General has asked to have the committee focused on his audits." End of quote. The Liberal majority on the Public Accounts Committee agreed. The Privacy Commissioner has asked that she be made an independent officer of the House and be granted ordering making authority. And the Liberal majority in this House rejects it, Mr. Speaker. So why does the Auditor General write a letter and have his requests fulfilled, but the Privacy Commissioner writes multiple reports and continues to be ignored?
The Honourable Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I disagree with the premise of the question. First of all, Mr. Speaker, the privacy officer, Mr. Speaker, has not been ignored when she provides issues that are related to. We oppose those. But I also want to tell the honourable member that the Auditor General is independent from government. It makes reports. Public Accounts is there to go over those reports, Mr. Speaker, to continue to make sure that the opposition get to shine light on the issues, not that governments bring forward, but the independent Auditor General brings forward. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we created another committee on health. I've been in this House since 2003, Mr. Speaker. No governing party was willing to put the scrutiny of the largest department under the microscope. Our government has chosen to do that. That's being open and transparent, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, let's face it, the inconsistency of this government doesn't stop here. In a commentary around his motion to strip decision-making from elected members, the member from Clare Digby said the change, and I quote, follows best practices that we have across Canada. It is a standard and a process that many other public accounts committees follow, end of quote. In another legislature across Canada, including PEI, Quebec, and the House of Commons, the Privacy Commissioner is an officer of the House and has order-making authority. This government cites President to reduce accountability, but ignores Presidents when it comes time to increase it. How does the Premier choose when to follow the ironclad rule? Or perhaps is it only when it's convenient for him?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure that I've ever found the Auditor General convenient for a government of any stripe, Mr. Speaker. The Auditor General is there to hold public to account. We're giving the Auditor General an opportunity to be in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, to the reports that he brings forward, to have the opposition, Mr. Speaker, scrutinize those reports, go through them. And we've also laid out, Mr. Speaker, another committee that is dealing with the largest budget item in our province, Mr. Speaker, which is the Department of Health, and a committee to deal with that. Why is the honourable member opposed to giving the independent Auditor General more opportunity to go over the way this government is spending its tax dollars? And at the same time, why is she opposed to us opening up the Department of Health for more scrutiny?
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Finance. Yesterday evening, the government's amendment to the Gaming Control Act was before Law Amendments Committee. Members of the committee were surprised, as was heard earlier, to learn that the Nova Scotia Gaming Corp paid more than $7,000 of public funds to fly 3 experts to Halifax to testify in favour of that bill, Mr. Speaker. The Gaming Corp stands to gain from relaxing the rules of the program that ban problem gamblers from the Casino for Life, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Minister, does the Minister understand how this questionable use of public funds undermines trust in the Gaming Corporation?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. I believe that the Premier has made it very clear that the decision to bring folks in from the Responsible Gaming Council was a decision of the Gaming Corp. The intent was honourable, I believe. The intent was to make sure, because we had made reference to experts, that those people who were providing advice to the Gaming Corp were able to be there to answer questions for the members or to provide more information. That was the intent. I believe it was honourable. It was not the right thing to do to have those expenses covered by taxpayers in the province, and that will not happen.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as was mentioned earlier, the committee does receive written submissions often, Mr. Speaker. Every year for the past 20 years, 1% of revenue from VLTs in Nova Scotia and a matching amount from the lottery sales and casino profits have flowed into a fund held by the Gaming Awareness Foundation of Nova Scotia. These funds are meant to support community efforts to reduce the harmful effects of gambling. $6 million is left sitting in the fund unspent, Mr. Speaker, and the government hasn't updated the 5-year gaming strategy, which was last updated in 2011. So I'd like to ask the Minister, when will Nova Scotians see the direction the current government is going to take when dealing with problem gambling by updating the gaming strategy, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. The member has referenced the gaming strategy many times in the House. 2005, I believe, was the first gaming strategy. 2011, it was updated by the government of the day. We continue to follow that strategy, but as always, we are looking at ways that we can provide the best support for any Nova Scotian who may feel troubled through gambling.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. In 2017, the Public Accounts Committee met 20 times, which was an election year. In 2017, the Auditor General released 11 chapters. Already in 2018, despite the best efforts of the government to take the summer off and kind of wait for some meetings, the committee has met 20 times. So far, the Auditor General has released 5 chapters. The Liberal majority of the Public Accounts Committee has capped the number of meetings to the number of chapters. So why has the government decided that Nova Scotians need half the accountability that it had before?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, thank the Honourable for the question. The reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General will continue to make reports available that we scrutinized by Public Accounts. I want to also remind the Honourable Member parts of those committees when they sat. Those 20 that you're referring to, we're talking about the Department of Health, Mr. Speaker. Unlike governments before us, we've opened up another committee that will take all of those that were before Public Accounts and the Department of Health and be scrutinized in the open way. It's focused on the Department of Health. That is being open and transparent, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you very much. And of course, we look good for the proposal to come forward on having a health committee, but we haven't seen the full proposal yet or come out with the plan, so we don't know what it's going to be. I guess the government thinks that committees may be just too much work. The Premier has said in the House that our Public Accounts Committee sits twice as many as any other in the country, so I guess that's a good precedent. But there is a way the Public Accounts Committee can keep its schedule, and that is to add more chapters of the Auditor General. So will the Premier commit to increasing the funding to the Auditor General so he can provide more chapters and help restore the accountability that this government has removed?
The Honourable Premier.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I have more faith in the Auditor General than an honourable member. I believe the Auditor General will provide them with enough information, Mr. Speaker, to continue to be able to hold public accounts, Mr. Speaker. And the reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, they're continuing to do work. They're looking at different departments, different issues. Today there was a report put out. I look forward to being analysed in public accounts. And I want to remind the honourable member again, we are not afraid to have the Department of Health reviewed in a public forum in a committee, unlike when he was in power.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is the Minister of Health. Last April, the Nova Scotia Health Authority decided to skip a rural doctor's recruitment opportunity in Newfoundland. The NSHA said it skipped the event because it was too expensive. Given how frugal the NSHA was about doctor recruiting trips, it was surprising to see in the Auditor General's report today that the NSHA spent almost $900 on a going-away party and almost $8,500 on a Christmas party. So my question to the Minister, will the Minister admit that when it comes to taxpayer dollars, the NSHA has its priorities backwards?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member bringing forward some information that came forward from the Auditor General's report. Mr. Speaker, when the NSHA became aware, the Auditor General highlighted the deficiencies in the controls and policies in place. With respect to hospitality expenses, they took those recommendations to heart. They've made changes, Mr. Speaker, and I believe they've recently had those policies updated and approved by the board to prevent that type of expense occurring that way again.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It'll be nice to see those policies put in place. Mr. Speaker, upcoming in the next week or so, there's going to be another rally in the Waterford. Mr. Speaker, the people of Cape Breton are getting tired of not hearing answers from the government of when the buildings are going to be built, how many beds are going to be in it, where they're going to be built, and when the completion date is going to be, and what's going to happen to the institutions when they're done. So again, I'm going to ask the Minister of Health, will he commit to coming to a rally in Cape Breton on October the 14th to attend, to hear what the people have to say, and maybe give us an update on the questions that we're asking here in the legislature? Mr. Speaker, a simple yes or no will do.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are many questions in the statements from the member opposite. Mr. Speaker, the answers. Mr. Speaker, the answers to those questions about the bed structure within the facilities, the timelines, Mr. Speaker, of the building, all of that, Mr. Speaker, work is underway as part of the functional planning. Mr. Speaker, we made it very clear in June when we made the announcement that that was the next step to be initiated. That work, Mr. Speaker, is underway to look at the process as well as the outcomes for the proper configuration of those resources to ensure the health care in those communities going forward.
The honourable member for Sackville Beaverbank.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question today is to the Minister of Health. Minister, recently a number of people have approached me with concerns around mental health treatment in the community. The Cobequid Community Health Centre provides many services on a limited basis, mental health being one of those. The concern seems to be based on the consistency of services and the role that the Cobequid Community Health Centre is being able to provide in services. So my question is, to the Minister is, what mental health services are available to the residents of Sackville, Beaverbank, Bedford and surrounding areas at the Cobequid Community Health Centre?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. As the member may be aware, mental health is one of the key pillars for this government and indeed in my mandate. Mr. Speaker, we've been taking a number of steps to invest and expand community-based access. Many of those initiatives, Mr. Speaker, are targeted towards youth and are in partnership with our Department of Education initiatives to expand access across the province and our community through our school systems, as well as other community-based systems like that modelled off of the Caper base. As far as the specific list of resources at that specific site, Mr. Speaker, I'd have to look up and get back to the member afterwards.
The honourable member for Sackville Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I guess, you know, when people are in a health crisis, time becomes essential. And to call the mobile mental health crisis team, that can result in a wait. I know that the clinic hours at the Cobequid Community Health Centre for many of the services, I brought this up here in the House before, are between 7 a.m. and 3 p.m. and the ER is only open to, from 7 a.m. to midnight. So it's not a 24-hour facility, but you know, mental health challenges can be at any time, night, day, and it doesn't fall between clinic hours. Can the minister explain what happens to a mental health patient who is in crisis and the mental health clinic is either closed or closing when a patient presents himself to the Cobequid Community Health Centre?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the member raises a very good point with respect to when and how mental health crisis may strike. We, I believe, Mr. Speaker, collectively on all sides of this legislature recognize that mental health issues can impact anyone at any time. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, for all Nova Scotians, when or if they are presenting in a time of mental health crisis, there is a crisis line that, Mr. Speaker, they can contact to ensure that they get assessed and ensure that the appropriate resources in many cases can be dispatched to them to be evaluated and ensure they get to the appropriate care for their needs.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. For months now, I've been raising concerns about the use of solitary confinement in our provincial correctional facilities. Earlier in this sitting, I asked the Minister if he had concerns about the province's vulnerability to a class action lawsuit related to solitary confinement, as we've seen in other provinces. Well, an action was filed Monday, alleging that the use of solitary confinement for consecutive periods exceeding 15 days constitutes cruel and unusual punishment in contravention of Section 12 of the Charter. Mr. Speaker, can the minister explain why this situation was not addressed before it had to be taken to the courts?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. My colleague would know, Mr. Speaker, that the courts are there to provide a legal analysis of concerns that are brought forward through our broad community. In this case, Mr. Speaker, somebody has taken advantage of that process. We respect that process, Mr. Speaker. The specifics of that case I'm not familiar with, nor would I speak to in this legislature.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At issue in the class actions filed in both Ontario and Nova Scotia is the use of administrative segregation, in which inmates are isolated either to ensure their own safety or those of others in this institution, which the minister has referenced several times in this House. As I pointed out before, there are far more instances of administrative close confinement in our provincial system than any other reason. Close confinement must be a last resort if it is used at all. If people in provincial correctional facilities are requesting to be placed in close confinement, solitary confinement, in a cell 23 hours a day to feel safe, then that points to a bigger problem. Mr. Speaker, again I will ask, will the minister commit today to a full public review of close confinement in our provincial correctional facilities?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague would know, Mr. Speaker, that the Ombudsman's Office has full access on a quarterly basis, Mr. Speaker, to our correctional facilities for the purposes of monitoring close confinement. We're working with our Human Rights Commission, Mr. Speaker, to have full access to the correctional facilities for purposes of evaluating and assessing individuals' human rights. Mr. Speaker, Elizabeth Fry and many other agencies are within our facilities and within our institutions providing support to those who find themselves in those circumstances.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question for you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. I often hear from my constituents about the doctor shortage that we're experiencing in Dartmouth. We learned, Mr. Speaker, over the summer that Dartmouth has been hard hit, seeing a 42.6% rise in patients without a doctor from January 1st to July 1st. Recent family residency seats were added throughout the province, but Dartmouth, being in the central zone, did not receive any. I, along with my colleagues from Dartmouth North and Dartmouth South, have said many times that the shortage is only getting worse in Dartmouth. My question is this, Mr. Speaker, with 40% of the family doctors in Dartmouth expected to retire in the next 5 years, what is the minister's plan to help the residents of Dartmouth acquire a family doctor? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the member highlighting the expansion and the important program, the expansion of our family residency program, and the role that plays in helping secure the training opportunities for future family physicians, as well as encouraging them to stay and continue to practice here in the province. With respect to Dartmouth and indeed all of the province, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of recruitment initiatives underway from our expansion and changes of the way we work our incentive programs, Mr. Speaker. We have a new program that the Department of Immigration for an immigration stream to bring physicians into the province on an expedited basis. Mr. Speaker, we're taking a number of steps forward, and we look forward to seeing continued results and recruitment from those efforts.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the statistics show that the Central Zone is the hardest hit by the doctor shortage. At times, Mr. Speaker, there is the perception that Metro has all the doctors, but there are parts of HRM, Dartmouth specifically, that are hurting due to a lack of doctors. The Central Zone, Mr. Speaker, is currently maxed out on family residency seats at 17. My question is this: what is being done to get the Central Zone patients a family doctor? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member makes a good point that historically and for far too long, the assumption was that the urban centres were not having problems recruiting and retaining physicians. Indeed, since the establishment of the 811 Need a Family Practice List, we have been able to identify where people have come forward to indicate their need, that they're looking for family practice care and coverage. And through that information, Mr. Speaker, we're able to clearly show that the needs, as the member highlighted, in the central region also exist. And because of that, Mr. Speaker, we have changed our incentive programs. We've enabled the central region, the urban areas, to be eligible for those recruitment incentives, something that was previously only eligible in rural parts of the province.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Health Minister likes to use the same old lines over and over on how well our professionals in the medical field are doing. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I believe this to be true. We know they're doing a great job, but there's just not enough of them. The government made a promise to Nova Scotians that they would have a family doctor, each and every Nova Scotian. The 100,000 who don't are left to fend for themselves because the government has become tone deaf to their concerns. We have Nova Scotia-born international medical graduates who participated and passed Canadian licensing requirements, done their clinical placements, but still can't get a residence here in Nova Scotia. So my question for the minister is, would the minister agree that there would be a greater retention of Nova Scotia-born IMGs if they were offered residencies at home as opposed to someone from away?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe I've explained the challenge with what can be perceived perhaps as a simple fix to change and provide dedicated residency seats to international medical graduates from our province. Mr. Speaker, I've highlighted that our residency program is part of a national residency matching process. Mr. Speaker, making those changes and becoming a bit protectionist and dedicated to our own residents, Mr. Speaker, runs the risk of other jurisdictions doing the same. And Mr. Speaker, we do rely on physicians coming from other jurisdictions, particularly in very dedicated specialties where we may not have the capacity to provide the necessary training. So, Mr. Speaker, it is far more complex than the simple solution the member is suggesting.
Honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, I've risen in this House on countless occasions to request that the Minister of Health attend a number of community health rallies that have taken place in my area. Each time he's been a no-show due to scheduling conflicts. Instead of informing the House of his decision, he chooses to tell the Cape Breton Post. The decisions the Minister is making in his tower in Halifax are negatively impacting the health outcomes of many Cape Bretoners, and if he attended, he would hear this for himself. The Minister has been aware for the last 2 weeks of an upcoming health rally taking place on October 14th. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know I'm not the Cape Breton Post, but my question for the Minister is, will he stand up, give me a simple yes or no, on if he will be attending, or do I have to read it in the paper again?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've mentioned, I do disagree with the member's premise there. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I and this government take the healthcare concerns of Cape Bretoners and indeed all Nova Scotians very seriously. But Mr. Speaker, that's why we're looking to the future to ensure that the care that Cape Bretoners and all Nova Scotians need are in place.
Please, the Honourable Minister of Health.
We're making the investments, Mr. Speaker. We've taken the information and feedback from clinicians and others, Mr. Speaker, who recognize that we need to look forward, that we need to invest in new infrastructure to provide the care in communities like Cape Breton region, Mr. Speaker. Those are the steps we're taking, and that's the work that's going to continue for the health care needs of that community and all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, in 1996, the Liberal government of the day created the only tolled section of the Trans-Canada Highway. At the time, the people of Cumberland North, both individuals and businesses that export, were told when the bonds were paid, the tolls would come off. I'd like to table a couple documents, Mr. Speaker, from 2014-2015 that says the toll collection will cease upon complete payment of all costs and liabilities related to the facility, and the forecasted repayment date is 2019. The next year, it states the exact same thing. However, last year, it states the forecasted repayment date of costs and liabilities changed to 2026. My question to the Minister of TIR is, how does the date for repayment of the bonds and commitment for ceasing the collection of tolls increase by 7 years, and what type of creative accounting creates this?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question, because it gives me an opportunity to tell the people of Nova Scotia and tell the members of this House what a fabulous financial process was set up when the Western Alignment Corporation went ahead. It's in an excellent position financially. As we indicated, we're looking at 1920 to review whether or not we can pay that bond off 6 or 7 years earlier than what was originally anticipated. But the most important thing to remember about the Western Alignment Corporation, and known as the Cobequid Pass, is the over 40 lives that we can demonstrate were saved. Many of those are Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Just as a reminder, it was 2019, which is next year, not 2020, that bonds were scheduled to be paid off. The Cobequid Pass is a cash cow for this government, and it's on the backs of the people of Cumberland, on the backs of businesses taking their products to market, on the backs of seniors and families going to medical appointments at the IWK and the infirmary. In 2017, the gross revenues were $22 million. Realizing over $9 million a year in net revenues for the government. Much of this money is on the backs of the people of Cumberland. My question to the minister is, will he commit to giving back 50% of the net revenues to the people of Cumberland to help us with our health care services and economic development?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Speaker, and I would remind the member that a similar question in the last session resulted in me tabling this report, which I'd like to table again, that clearly documents that by paying a $4 toll at the pass, everybody who takes it is saving money. That's the CAA report. I'd like to table that, Mr. Chairman. We have a commitment, Mr. Speaker, to review the toll situation in the 1920 fiscal year, which we intend to follow through on with a view to removing the toll for Nova Scotia motorists. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Environment. The province has already paid $6 million to Northern Pulp for costs associated with designing the new effluent treatment system. The province could also end up on the hook to reimburse Northern Pulp's lost profits for any time the mill is shut down if the new treatment system is not ready on time. This could cost the province millions of dollars if the project isn't done as quickly and cheaply as possible, which makes one wonder if that is why the province has insisted on applying the quickest and cheapest regulatory requirements possible. So can the minister understand why residents believe the province is in a conflict of interest?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
thank the honourable member for the question. You know, as all members of this House know, the environment of Nova Scotia is my primary concern. We haven't yet received an environmental assessment application from Northern Pulp. When that application does come in, we'll put it through the very strictest process, including a consultation process, and make a decision based on the facts and science. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Truro, Babel Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Mr. Speaker, the clock is ticking to 2020, and Eco-Justice is a legal organization with over 2 decades of experience in environmental law. They are responsible for dozens of significant court decisions, many of them precedent-setting. And, Mr. Speaker, they've looked at the Northern Pulp Effluent Plan, and they believe there's a conflict of interest. They say a federal environmental assessment is necessary because the province has too much at stake, both financially and legally. If the process isn't fixed, they could challenge any decision in court. So, Mr. Speaker, this government may be trying to dismiss concerns of citizens, but it's clear the fishers, environmentalists, and community members are not going to let them get away with it. So my question for the minister is this: why doesn't she support a federal assessment and get this right before the courts have to be brought into the question?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll thank the honourable member for that question again. You know, it's very strict, the guidelines that we have with the Department of Environment. First of all, we have to receive an application, which we haven't received yet. We certainly can't push that process. It's up to Northern Pulp to provide that application. When that does come in, there are very strict guidelines as well as to what requires what kind of assessment, whether it's a level 1 or level 2. This, in all fact, is an effluent treatment plant and falls under the guidelines of level 1. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, recently people in my constituency have approached me with concerns about the new United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, or previous to yesterday, the NAFTA agreement. The Premier knows supply management has been a critical factor in the success of Nova Scotia agriculture. In fact, all agricultural sectors have benefited from the stability that supply management has given our province. Now our dairy farmers, our chicken farmers, our egg farmers and turkey farmers have been hurt by this recent USMCA trade agreement. My question, Mr. Speaker, for the Premier is what has he done to communicate to the Liberal government in Ottawa the critical need for the protection of supply management in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable for the question. Mr. Speaker, I agree with the premise of his question and around the importance of supply management to our province and the agricultural sector. He's highlighted the issues that have been raised with the elimination yesterday of the Class 7 provision inside of the former agreement causes great concern to us. We're continuing to work with our partners throughout the sector, both in all of the supply managed commodities that are referred to figure out what the actual impact is on them, to ensure that we continue to make the case, as we will over the next 60 days, of the importance of that sector and this industry to the rural economy of our great province.
The honourable member for Kings North.
To thank the Premier for that answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we know that the federal government has promised compensation. The Premier is famous for his trade trips to China. However, maybe he should have taken trips to a little closer to home, like Ottawa or Washington, given the outcome of this trade agreement, or even now through Kings North and other parts of Nova Scotia to explain how this agreement will affect our farmers. My question for the Premier is this: will he postpone his trip or vacation to get away from us all to China and do his job instead and go to Ottawa and inform the federal government about the need to see our agriculture sector prosper and continue to grow instead of being stagnated by a new trade agreement?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a very narrow view of the economy of our province, Mr. Speaker, that the honourable member is projecting, quite frankly. It is important that we continue to go out and make sure that we protect sectors inside of our province, that we continue to open up markets. I want to assure the honourable member many times I've spoken to the national government on issues related to this province, as well as being in Washington. Part of the NAFTA agreement yesterday was Clause 232, which will not impose tariffs on Michelin Tire, which is creating jobs in the Annapolis Valley. The honourable member's constituency will be affirmed. I was very proud to be part of that team that went down, Mr. Speaker, to articulate the important part of the integration of their businesses all across North America. I want to remind the honourable member we have the exclusion of the softwood lumber sector, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to make sure we do that, but we're going to continue to work on the supply managed side to ensure that the agricultural sector, which is vibrant in my part of this province, across the province, will continue to make the case to ensure that we continue that our voice is heard. Again, I want to tell the honourable member, though, we're working out with those individual sectors to ensure that we fully appreciate and understand what impact on them with the elimination of Class 7.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Justice. Despite the changes to the Maintenance Enforcement Act in 2016, the May Auditor General report on maintenance enforcement concluded that the program is not adequately monitoring or enforcing court orders. There is currently $60 million owed to recipients, both individuals and families, who rely on these payments. The Auditor General made 6 recommendations to improve the program. Given that there are over 7,500 families suffering because of the outstanding child support payments to the tune of $60 million, will the Minister update the House on how many of the 6 recommendations made by the Auditor General have been completed?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. The Maintenance Enforcement Program, to my colleague's point, has outstanding liabilities by those who have not paid. The figure itself, Mr. Speaker, $60 million, there's about $15 million of that is considered unenforceable because of the existing circumstances of those who are responsible to pay, both those who may be in custody and those who aren't financially able, Mr. Speaker. Another $25 million of that, Mr. Speaker, is out of province. We are working with our provincial colleagues quite literally across the country. What I will share with my colleague, Mr. Speaker, relative to the amount, we are down now to about $58 million as a result of changes that have been made. This is the lowest number that has accumulated over the past 30 years, Mr. Speaker, and is reflective of the good work that our people in maintenance enforcement are doing to drive these numbers down.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
With all due respect to all of those parents out there who are without that income, it's cold comfort. The Ombudsman report that came out for 2017-18 shows that the number of complaints for the Department of Justice has not improved over the last 3 years. The report highlighted that there are many complaints about the enforcement process itself. Constituents are calling my office telling me that they are desperate and they end up on social assistance when they can't get money from the ex-spouse, when the ex-spouse works under the table, or they just flat out refuse to make the payments. Lawyers tell me that it is often too expensive to take an ex-spouse back to court to get a revised maintenance payment, especially if their income has changed. So my question to the Minister is, can the Minister explain what his department has done to recoup that $45 million and to improve the court's ability to impose penalties on those who fail to pay their child support payments?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I indicated to my colleague earlier, we are seeing the lowest number in outstanding balance that we've seen in the history of this program, Mr. Speaker, and that's reflective of all parties in government, Mr. Speaker. This is not something that was created yesterday. So there is collective responsibility, but there is also great work being done by those within maintenance enforcement. In the previous budget, Mr. Speaker, we added 6 additional FTEs in the facility in New Waterford to address some of the concerns that my colleague is speaking about. Mr. Speaker, the Premier himself has elevated this to the Council of Federation. This is a national issue. We are working with our provincial partners, and I want to make a commitment to my colleague. These are the priorities of this government. We will address the maintenance enforcement program, and we'll continue to drive this balance down.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. The Ontario government has a searchable database online to help families who are faced with having to place a loved one in a long-term care facility. The search tool contains information such as the home's name, address, average wait times, and number of beds in the facility. It also makes public and transparent broad results of an annual inspection and the number of times an inspector finds something has not met statutory requirements. Will the Minister agree that this level of openness and transparency shown by the Government of Ontario builds confidence in the long-term care system and increases the level of care?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Indeed, I do agree that we can do better here, Mr. Speaker. That's why we've committed to providing more information about long-term care inspections, as well as complaints reviews to be published. Mr. Speaker, that's on top of the work that's ongoing to disclose and post information relating to pressure injuries in our long-term care facilities. Mr. Speaker, these are steps that are underway in addition to the work of the panel of experts that we've convened to review the quality of care in our long-term care facilities. We look forward to the information and recommendations coming forward by the end of November.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, over the weekend, the CBC program called White Coat, Black Art examined a recent inquiry in long-term care in Ontario. One advocate for the elderly pointed out that Ontario has the most robust system in Canada. She pointed out that Nova Scotia's long-term care system is not open. She said people must FOIPOP inspection reports, and even then, many pages are redacted. She called it a bit of a black hole. So my question is, will the minister admit when their system makes national news for lack of openness and transparency, it's time to make some needed changes?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been open and transparent both in this legislature and in public, Mr. Speaker, about our commitment to move forward with providing more information and details about our inspection reports, pressure injuries rates, Mr. Speaker, to make that information available online. Mr. Speaker, at the same time, we do have to respect in some instances, the fact of the matter is we're dealing with people's personal health information. There are requirements to ensure that we do go through an appropriate process to protect that information before it is made public. So that's the work that's ongoing. We're going to work within the rules to get us more information available to build confidence in the work that is ongoing in our long-term care system.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. It has been 2 years since the Halifax Regional School Board voted democratically and after open debate to accept the recommendations of the School Options Committee to build a new North End Junior High in Halifax. That recommendation was based on hundreds of hours of volunteer work and months of consultation. So my question to the Minister is, what can he say to residents of Halifax Needham who shaped the recommendations of the School Options Committee that were communicated to the Department of Education 2 years ago?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our province has engaged in the first long-term capital planning process that we've had in our history. This allows us to better prepare for the needs of communities and better communicate early on what our intentions are in each community. That process is informed by the priorities that do come from our regions, some of which were previously dictated by the former boards, some of which moving forward will be supported by the operational needs that are expressed through the executive leadership and their teams. And this is a 5-year rolling plan. So we do have $300 million budgeted right now to execute on 13 major projects, but every single year there'll be additional projects added to that plan, and communities will be informed of those changes as they occur.
Please, time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call public bills for third reading?
We'll now call public bills for third reading.
Would you please call Bill number 27, the Animal Protection Act?
We'll now call Bill number 27, the Animal Protection Act. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 27, an act to protect animals and aid animals in distress, now be read for a third time and do pass.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I had the privilege to stand here last week and share some concerns regarding this bill from emails and phone calls that most of us have received on this side of the Government House. Of course, there are some good things in this bill. There's no doubt about that. But there is some grey area in this bill. As I've stated in the past, we're not convinced that full consultation was done with all stakeholders. Example, the Canadian Kennel Club. It was very vocal that to law amendments and several emails throughout our constituencies that they have not been consulted to 100%. Even more worrisome is the strong arm of the law that we're going to give officers of the SPCA. There's a lot of grey area in that. We have heard from owners of companion animals, agricultural families, and they still have concerns that this bill is not where it needs to sit. As I have stated, there is good things in this bill, very good things, but there is a lot of grey areas. Driving here yesterday from home, a farmer shared a story, and we all know the cats are dropped off at barns on a regular basis. If a neighbour complains about that barn, for them having 30 or 40 or an abundance amount of cats, and the SPCA shows up at their house, does that give legal entity that they are the owner of that cat or the custodian? There's a question there. Does the SPCA have powers to go and seek into their barns, creating an issue with bio cross-contamination in the barns? Does it give them entitlement to inspect further agricultural animals rather than just companion animals? There's many, many questions here, Mr. Speaker, that lay unread or unanswered, if you will. So our caucus feels that with the grey areas, companion animals, yes, they may have some answers, but how much power is the SPCA actually going to receive in this? How much power will inspectors from Department of Environment and SPCA coexist with this bill? I'm just asking government to step back a little bit on this. Go back to the stakeholders and speak a little bit further. Get more consultation and answer some of those questions to the grey area. That's very least that we can ask for our farmers and our companion animal owners. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make the following motion. I move that Bill 27 be not now read a third time, but that it be read a third time this day 6 months hence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the motion put forward by my colleague. Mr. Speaker, I can think of a time when I was campaigning. I remember coming to this house, knocking on the door, and there was a nice little black lab there. And I remember the owner of the house using his cane to hit the dog, to bat it back into the house and get it out of the way. And I was thinking, how awful is this, what I've just witnessed? And I remember, you know, when you're in the middle of a campaign, how busy it is. And I remember feeling bad that I didn't report that right away to the SPCA, because by the time I did report it, it was kind of too late. But, Mr. Speaker, I think about that little dog when I'm rising to speak on this bill today, and I know the government is trying to put forward a bill here that is designed to protect animals, and I think that is something we all want to be doing in this House, Mr. Speaker. How we treat animals, I think, is a reflection of how we can treat our own fellow human beings. And I think about this bill and what will its effect be? Will there be unintended consequences? And that's why we've put forward this hoist motion. Put it aside for 6 months. Do some more consultation. I can think about there's been a number of animal lovers out there who have come forward with concerns, and they have raised their concerns. They don't feel they've been consulted, and maybe it is worth getting this right, taking the time to ensure that concerns like that are addressed. I think about an organization in my own constituency. When I was listening to my colleague speak, I was thinking about the Inverness Raceway, home to many, many cats, and once again, it's a favorite place, unfortunately, for people to drop off their cats. And you see them there on any given Wednesday night or Sunday afternoon, and they certainly do a job on the rodents, Mr. Speaker. But you know, it's not something that the executive of the board of the Raceway can really be held responsible for. And you know, I'm just worried with the passage of this bill that there could be unintended consequences for them. So, Mr. Speaker, that is why I've risen to speak today. I know that I know the impact of animals out there and how things can get out of hand quickly. I remember visiting one SPCA in a part of the province one time where I learned that 2 cats, if they go on to produce, can produce up to 10 million other cats in their lifetimes, which is an astonishing number, Mr. Speaker. But once the family tree gets out there and it starts expanding upon itself, it becomes immense. So, Mr. Speaker, I know the government has good intentions with this bill. We just feel, based on the feedback we have received, that it's time to hit the pause button, do some more consultation to make sure that people out there are supportive of what is happening. Thank you.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While we very much support animal protection and animal welfare, upon further thought about this bill, we feel that it was rushed through and needs more consultation, and so we are happy to support the motion to hold this bill off for another 6 months. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honoured today to speak to Bill 27, an act to protect animals and to aid animals in distress. I want to read a quote by Gandhi.
Please. Is the honourable member speaking to the amendment? You have to speak to the hoist motion.
Speaking to the hoist.
Okay. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
There is a quote that I want to read that says, by Gandhi, that says, the greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way it treats its animals. And we understand that this bill is going to change how those in Nova Scotia are allowed to treat their animals. So when I ran into the Minister of Agriculture on the weekend in Eastern Passage, we had an opportunity to talk, and I thank him for that opportunity. And he did go over with me something that I wasn't as aware of as I should have been, in that this is not a series of amendments. This is doing away with one act and completely replacing it with another. So it's a very long act. It's very difficult. I spent all weekend going through the old act versus the new act, trying to figure out what wording had been changed, what paragraphs had been left out. And it's not an easy process to go through. So I can understand why I've gotten so many emails from people who've picked out certain parts of the act, and in fairness to the minister, in some cases, they're upset about something that was in the old act, but they didn't realize that. They just are reading the act for the first time and thinking, well, this is new. So you can use force to go into a home while they're thinking that that's new. And I think the onus is on us as a government to not have those misperceptions out there. Because if we want the people in this province to trust us, ramming something through quickly without listening to what they're saying and addressing their fears is what we do with children. We say, don't worry, it'll be okay. But all of those emails and phone calls are saying, we're not okay with it right now. It's not okay the way it is, and we want it to be better and the best that it can be. One of the biggest concerns that we had sent to us was that people are afraid that the SPCA isn't going to need sufficient evidence in order to take action. Well, that's a reasonable fear if it's ever happened to anybody in this province. The government has not reassured people to the extent that it should, so taking 6 months more will help us get it right, and we'll be able to reassure people that those powers are not going to be used excessively. This Bill 27 outlaws cosmetic procedures such as declawing of cats, tail docking, and ear cropping. Well, I will be honest, we always had cats. They were always declawed. My father insisted, if my mother was going to allow them in the house, that they better not be picking apart her furniture. Well, when I brought it up with my veterinarian years ago, and they very bluntly said, that's like amputating off the tips of your fingers, I'm like, okay. I'll just buy inexpensive furniture and I'll let the cats claw it and I won't worry about it. But somebody had to explain that to me, and the veterinarians in this province have been speaking out more about what it is that they believe is humane treatment for our pets. This Bill 27 does toughen the rules around pet ownership in Nova Scotia, and I know that a warrant would still be needed to enter someone's home, but not necessarily the barn, and so the farmers are very concerned, and they want more consultation and more time. There's an awful lot of people who don't like the change from owner to custodian because they probably don't understand the intent of the government, which is for those cases when you show up at a barn or a home where an animal is being abused and no one will admit that they own the animal. So changing it for that reason makes sense, but the public doesn't understand that yet. So giving us 6 months more to help explain that to people will go a long way to helping government earn the trust of Nova Scotians. So who doesn't want our animals to be protected, and who wouldn't applaud legislation that reduces cruelty to animals and one that holds abusers accountable? We are a pet-loving province, and there isn't anybody who wouldn't agree that we want our pets, our farm animals, and those animals that are for sale to be free from undue stress, torture, and mutilation. But this issue, despite the government's best efforts, has divided Nova Scotians unlike any I have ever seen. The passion that we all feel for our pets is powerful and unwavering, second only to what we feel for our children. And sadly, this is a case where there is no middle ground in some cases. For those who are 100% in favour of this bill, they want us to vote yes and get it over with. But there are almost an equal number of people in my constituency and around the province who are afraid that the changes proposed will lead to economic instability and punitive nature for some of the dog breeders, and there are those who are afraid of the excessive powers. If the government is sure that that's not going to happen, then what would the harm be in taking another 6 months to educate the province? I just heard a member saying that that would be 6 more months of abuse, but these are Nova Scotians who own their pets, who love their pets, and they were talking about a small majority of people out there who are abusing their animals, and we don't want to overreact by giving excessive power to the SPCA or other organizations without consulting with the farmers, the animal lovers who own pets, and breeders. So what are we supposed to do as politicians when half of those who vote for us want the bill passed and the other half don't? Well, you take your time, as I did over this weekend and over the past talking with our party. We listen during law amendments. We reread what they said in law amendments, as I did, and all of the emails that I got. And an article by Jean LaRoche on September the 17th said that these are just a fraction of the concerns that they heard, and certainly they're a fraction of the concerns that our caucus has heard, and I'm assuming that all of us would have gotten the same set of emails. So what would happen after law amendments when people come and pour their hearts out for both sides of the issue? One would hope that something, anything that was said during law amendments would sway the government in some way or would change the government's mind. If historically people come to law amendments and pour out their hearts and travel from across this province, or perhaps get flown in from out west, if they pour out their heart and soul and nothing changes afterwards, then what is the point of law amendments? If we are the only ones that are still doing it, well, thank God for us. But if you're not going to amend anything, it's a show. So, we want to prove to Nova Scotians, I want us and this government to prove that we are a government as a whole, all three parties are willing to listen and then respond. I find it so sad and disheartening that all of these caring pet owners and farmers and breeders came all the way to Province House to share their thoughts, and yet there was not a single amendment brought forward, suggesting that no one was heard. This process failure annoys my constituents as much as some of the content of the bill, because they are left with a sick feeling and negative belief, which we don't really want to reinforce, but we're doing that. The belief is that it doesn't matter who gets consulted, and it doesn't matter what the public says or how loud they say it or how many say it, that this government is going to do what it wants anyway. This suggests an arrogance, not my words, an arrogance that is easily similar to what happened with the education bill and when the Glaze report was brought in and we rammed through all of the recommendations without consulting with, well, not we, a good point, the government did, without consulting with the teachers and the parents and the students and the principals. The following Law Amendment Committee member, Ben Jessom, announced that they were going to put the bill on. Sorry.
Order, please. I'd like to remind the honourable member not to refer to other members of this House by their proper names. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
My apologies, Mr. Speaker, for using a name inappropriately. One of our wonderful members from the opposition who was a part of the law amendments said they were going to put this on ice, but then we brought it forth with no further amendments. So, what we don't understand, Mr. Speaker, is why we're not listening to what people are saying. There are the farmers who are concerned about the biohazards of someone coming onto their farm and going into the barn. I spoke with a farmer on the weekend who said, I have 30 employees. There are only 6 of my own employees who are allowed into the barn because they're the ones who are trained to make sure that there are no illnesses or diseases brought in or spread out. So they have concerns that they are not comfortable with yet. So we have to ask, what about all of the other things that people are sending emails about? Did the government respond? One of the complaints that I had from my constituents is, I emailed the government, I didn't hear anything back. They didn't have the ability to come to law amendments, but they're suspicious that had they even come, nothing would have changed. So my colleagues have already said that holding off for 6 months, because this bill's been in existence for years, holding off another 6 months would allow everybody to come closer together. We won't agree on everything, certainly not, but what we do have a mission to do is to increase the public's trust in us. And we are asking this government to take 6 months, just till the next sitting of the legislature. We're putting a whole bunch of other things on hold until then. So one more wouldn't matter, but it might go a long way to allowing those who didn't have a voice to be heard. And so, Mr. Speaker, with that, I ask for this government to agree to the hoist and to hold this for another 6 months. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The motion is for Bill number 27 to be hoisted, suspended for 6 months. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye? Aye. Contrary minded, nay? No. There are several noes. The motion is defeated. The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River to speak to third reading of Bill number 27, the Animal Protection Act. The honourable motion member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I'm pleased to rise today to speak to Bill 27, an act to protect animals and to aid animals in distress for third reading. As I mentioned earlier, we are very much in support of animal protection and animal welfare. However, upon further reading of the bill and listening to many holders who came to law amendments, it is our determination that the bill was rushed through and needs more consultation with all stakeholders. Even the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture, who governments say they consulted, actually came to law amendments and said that further consultation is necessary. I'm also the critic for agriculture, so this concerns me greatly. Mr. Speaker, the Federation of Agriculture speaks for farmers right across the province and has been doing so since 1895. They represent over 2,400 farm businesses in 13 regions and in 29 commodity sectors. Ignoring the Federation of Agriculture is ignoring farmers. Farmers are such an important part of Nova Scotia. They put food on our tables, they contribute to our health and to food security. Agriculture is responsible for over 7,000 full-time jobs in the province. And along with fishers and foresters and filmmakers, they are the lifeblood of our rural communities and our businesses. Farmers should not be ignored. But this government is beginning to show a pattern of rushing changes without consulting all stakeholders. We've seen this a lot recently, and in fact, over the past 5 years. In this case, it's the dog breeders and farmers who are being ignored. We thought the Liberal Party had really listened to the concerns that were brought to law amendments when they agreed to send it back to the department for revision. But then they brought it back a week later with absolutely no changes and no further consultation. This is not okay, Mr. Speaker. It makes it clear that they have no real intention whatsoever of listening. It was just a tactic. And as we have seen lately, this tactic is being used over and over and over again, even including paying people to come and speak to bills which the Liberals themselves want to see passed. It's very disappointing. And it does not speak to the government's commitment to promoting animal welfare. It's a disservice to all of the good that is in this bill that the Liberals are not prepared to work with all the stakeholders to fix what is bad in the bill and what is not working. The bill doesn't adequately consider the biosecurity risk involved in inspectors crossing from one farm to get to another. The National Farm Animal Care Council codes of practice referenced in the bill does not provide codes for all animals and breeds, so there are gaps that need to be covered. The lack of clarity between companion animals and working farm animals potentially creates confusing overlap between Nova Scotia environment inspectors and SPCA inspectors, which will result in added red tape for farmers. There are concerns about the lack of oversight, accountability, and qualifications for inspectors. The Canadian Kennel Club says it first heard of the proposed changes on September the 13th, when the rest of the public did. And we heard overwhelmingly at law amendments that many impacted people feel blindsided. Many of these people are, in fact, my constituents and many others in the rural districts of Nova Scotia. Cape Breton is one of them. Breeding businesses will be significantly impacted, Mr. Speaker, and given how ambiguous much of the bill is, it's still unclear to what extent they will be impacted and how much time they will have to adjust. I'm being told this is going to affect their pocketbooks and their homes and the love that they feel for the animals as well. Mr. Speaker, over the summer, the Department of Environment tried to make changes on how they provide inspection to abattoirs without checking with the people who are actually on the ground doing the work. Meat inspection is an important part of our health and safety regulations, but it needs to be done in a way that works with small farmers so that regulation doesn't favor bigger agribusinesses and push small farmers out of business. But the Department of Environment ignored that. They were focused on saving the department a little bit of money by reducing their staffing costs associated with meat inspection. They wanted to make meat inspectors only available after 8 a.m., much later than some small abattoirs begin their practice. And they wanted all slaughter to be scheduled 2 weeks in advance without understanding the realities of how small meat farmers serve their local customers. The Department of Environment was prioritizing small savings over the negative impacts on small abattoirs and small farms. That decision would have cost the rural economy much more than any money the department could hope to save. Thankfully, farmers worked hard and worked together to push back and make themselves heard. So the department had to slow down these changes and eventually agreed to work with farmers. The bill before us is another example of this government dismissing farmers' concerns and dog breeders' concerns as well. Well, Nova Scotians deserve better than that. Aspects of the bill are vague, which is causing uncertainty and confusion about how it will be enforced and precisely what will and will not be allowed. Ambiguous laws do not make good laws, and the intent of this bill would be better served if the government would consult with all stakeholders, not just some, and do the work needed to make the law clear. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to stand up today to speak on the repeal and the replacement of the Animal Protection Act. Mr. Speaker, it's of course extremely important that we as a civilized society and we here in Nova Scotia do everything that we can to protect the welfare of companion animals as well as farm animals. I, for one, am a farmer and have been a farmer for the last 10 years of my life. I don't come from a farming background and I don't come from a farming family. I do, however, come from a family of animal lovers. My dad would have been the kind of guy that would have put a spider outdoors if he would have seen one inside. It's extremely important to understand that many people in Nova Scotia, whether they're farmers for generations or they're people that just have enjoyed having what we now call companion animal, domesticated animals in their homes, there's a lot of good people in this province that have these animals in their homes, on their properties, and take excellent care of them. We unfortunately also have those folks that we need to be writing these laws for, and it's unfortunate that we even have to think about people who would be putting animals at risk, but it's important, obviously, that laws, good laws, well-researched laws, and those that receive the proper consultation are put forward in order to be able to make certain that we have the best legislation put forward to be able to make 100% that we have the most up-to-date and the best standards for humane treatment and the welfare of animals in this province. Being a farmer, and I'm not sure how many people in this House have ever been on a farm or lived on a farm or owned a farm for that matter, it's quite an intense profession to be involved in, and it's specifically extremely intense when you have the care and I take it, and I know that many farmers take it very seriously, the care of so many animals on your property. I have seen myself in a barn in the middle of the night, 3-4 times a night, trying to keep an animal alive. It is the most horrible experience for me, even after 10 years of farming, to see a small little lamb or a ewe or a ram, and just a couple of years ago, my donkey unfortunately passed away quite suddenly on the farm. It's absolutely heartbreaking to see when these things happen to animals, and specifically on farm. It's extremely difficult for those who own, obviously, agricultural, and we call them agricultural businesses, but everyone knows that those who farm are often people who obviously have to like the lifestyle as well, because let's face it, you don't make a whole bunch of money as a small and medium-sized farmer in this day and age in Nova Scotia, which I certainly hope that we can turn that around. As far as Bill 27, I think one of the things that I find most egregious of this whole experience in watching this legislation go through is very similar to what we saw during law amendments, the law amendments process with the Education Act. Law amendments, as one of my colleagues has mentioned here in the House just earlier, is part of the process in which the public can come forward to this House, to our government, and to the members that sit in the opposition as well, and put forward their concerns of what they see as red flags, or perhaps areas that need a little bit more research and a bit more consultation, or perhaps something where none of us are perfect in this House, perhaps something that we just did not see within the legislation in the first place. When people come to law amendments, that's part of their democratic process. It is part of our democracy to be able to allow people to come forward and give them enough time to do so. They should have enough notice. They should have the ability to be able to come and put forward their concerns to the government and opposition. In this case, it's government that's tabling this bill, and make certain that their possible amendments, or their concerns at least, are heard and at least given some sort of credence to be able to make changes within a bill. That's the whole point of law amendments in the first place. However, I really do think that we're starting to forget that. Law amendments is not just some part of the parliamentarian system that we just kind of go through very quickly, and it's like, well, nobody's going to take anyone's concerns very seriously in there anyway. I mean, why bother going through the process at all if none of the amendments are actually going to be taken seriously and are going to make their way into legislation that affects every single Nova Scotian across this province? The Federation of Agriculture presented, and thank goodness that they did. It was good to see them there at law amendments. I was present as well and watching the proceedings. Both they and the Canadian Kennel Club both made some suggestions and brought about their concerns at how quickly the turnaround time was happening without further consultations being done before this bill goes through. Listen, I want to protect animals as much as anyone in this province. I absolutely love every single animal that is on my farm. I try to take the best care possible, as I know most farmers in Nova Scotia do, as far as the animals that are on their farm, whether they're there for companionship, or they're there as part of a flock, a livestock. But I just don't want to see, and I never want to see, whether it's this bill or any other bill, I don't want to see bad laws go through on the books in this province. And I feel more and more as time goes by, we're just trying to push legislation through just to make sure we can get, okay, that's checked off, the next one's checked off, and we can get to the next thing. If there are these many people, and I truly have received hundreds of emails from folks who are concerned about the legislation that is about to go through this House, there's a serious problem with the legislation, Mr. Speaker. Surely not all of these people can be coming forward with concerns, and that these concerns have no merit. So, Mr. Speaker, with that said, again, I will say that, from an agricultural perspective, I have some major concerns, and I have heard from other farmers as well that have major concerns. There was a lack of consultation from the agricultural community. I know, for one, I have a closed flock farm, and for those people in the House that don't understand what that is, and many people in poultry and other sectors of agriculture have very similar things, it's taken me years and years to be able to make certain that my flock is disease-free, and it's been very expensive to be able to get to that standard on farm, as I know it is for so many other folks. It's really important that we adhere to biohazard standards on farm. If somebody is crossing my farmland or farmland in particular without a farmer noticing it and not knowing that that person is going to be crossing land, an inspector or an animal control officer, it puts that farm at risk from a biohazard perspective. And this is directly in the legislation that we're putting forward, that a special, that an inspector can actually cross land without having to let the landowner know. The other thing that makes me, I think the first thing that I saw that was really worrisome in here is actually being able to enter someone's property, enter a barn, enter a field, enter anything with just probable cause. So, Mr. Speaker, I would echo the other voices within this legislature today, at least on the opposition side, that I truly believe that we need to give this legislation more time. And as much as we do have to protect animals within this province, there is legislation in place. There is currently legislation in place. It may not be the best that it can be, but I think it's our responsibility that instead of putting forth something that perhaps has holes or some red flags in it that we really need to take account of, we should be putting forward 100% with 100% surety that we are putting together and putting forth the best bill possible to be able to make certain that we protect not only the animals in this province, but also those people who are the good people that own them or are custodians of them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Fine to recognize the Honourable Minister of Agriculture will be to close third reading of Bill number 27, the Animal Protection Act. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've been listening very intently to the opposition as they have brought some concerns forward, and those have been listened to and will be followed through on. But I want to clarify a few things. First of all, the Federation of Agriculture, there's a feeling here that they weren't consulted. They were in August. We have documentation who we met with and who our staff met with at that time and went through this bill in detail. And the minor changes are basically no changes that for the Department of Ag for farm. You can the inspectors through environment can go on a farm anytime they want. That's always been the case since the early 90s, and it will continue to be. And as far as any procedures, the agriculture in the province is exempt from the things that are similar to the SPCA, which they would enforce, such as tail docking and other things. So, as far as the Department of Agriculture is concerned, and the Department of the Industry is concerned, the agriculture industry, there is no change. There is no change in the Act. And people have been out there telling everybody there is a change in the Act, and you're allowed, now you can go on property. You can always go on their property, always. And if you're going to go into someone's home, you need a warrant. Absolutely have to warrant. That is no change since the mid-90s. So I want to make that very, very clear. Biosecurity will always be respected on farms. We're very concerned about that and always will be. And the Department of Environment inspectors are trained for that. Economic benefits for some. Well, this Act is about ensuring our animals are protected. That's what this. And when someone puts economic benefit against the welfare of our animals, and I'm an animal lover, I've got a black lab home that's so spoiled that part of the family, actually, is the best way to put it. And all my pets have always been the same way. And they always will be. And I was born on a farm, and I've seen all the activities on the farm, and the farm activities have changed over the years and been very, very well. And when we talk more about farms, we also, never been mentioned here, and everybody's talked about it. We're actively trying to grow Nova Scotia's economy. And one of the places we're trying to actively grow it is in agriculture. Now, as we go through these proceedings and talk about all this stuff, and we see we're trying to put out animals on the marketplace that have been well trained, well treated, all kinds of humane activities around the animals to make sure that indeed our animals are well protected and they're safe and they're looked after well. And I can tell you, we're watched internationally, absolutely internationally, what goes on. And that's a question that comes up in a meeting. How do you treat your animals for animal welfare? And if we can't say we've got some of the toughest rules in the world, they'll say, too bad, we're not interested in buying your products, even though that may be the case. And I'll give you one example in the fisheries, which also applies to agriculture. I was sitting in a room with a senior executive of a major company in China, and he asked me what the price of lobsters was today. I had no idea. The gentleman sitting beside him on his computer, he said, he gave me the exact price. And he said, what day in the last 5 years do you want to know what the price of lobsters at the wharf was in Nova Scotia? He said, you give me the date and I'll tell you. We're being watched all the time by our customers. So if we put economic benefit for a few people that are cropping tails and doing other things on companion animals, and indeed we look at this and say, well, for economic benefit. You talk about economic benefit. Economic benefits to the farmers, and we can get a higher price for their product. When I became fisheries minister, and using that as an example again, lobster was selling for $3 a pound, $3 a pound. Lobsters now are selling anywhere from $6 to $15 a pound. And thanks for the marketing that was done to get those to the marketplace, get them to the marketplace, that's made the difference. And the quality systems we put in place. So as you talk about this, and we talk about all these things, and you go through and see what is happening, really this bill has not changed a whole lot. You've got to do the research on the bill. You've got to do research on the previous bills to see what the wording is. And again, farms, there's no change. There's no change at all. But there's been people out there telling the farmers that that's indeed the case. And that's inaccurate information being provided to people. So as we look at this bill, and this bill was consulted on, this bill came as suggestions of the animal rights groups. Animal groups that we talked to, people that know the industry. And one comparison was used to cutting your finger off as declaring a cat. What's the difference in that? They're taking their tail off. What's the difference? And I heard through the grapevine, and it's just hearsay, but it's hearsay, that some of the people that are involved in this tail cropping activity were sedating animals to do it. Well, to my knowledge, only a veterinarian can do that. So you want to make sure that you get your facts right and watch who you're talking to. Anyone that is looking after their animals properly in this province of Nova Scotia will be not affected in any which way in this bill. Nobody will be. The few people, and I stress the very, very, very few people that are not treating their animals properly will be affected and should be affected. They should be charged, and they should go through the whole system to make sure that our animals are protected. I don't think there's one person in this room that would say that we don't want to protect our animals and make sure we're looking after the welfare. We have to do that through laws. We have to do that through regulations. So this is an effort to do that and bring it forward. And one of the main things that really this bill actually talks about is making the appeal hearings public before they're all closed doors. So if the SPCA or the Department of Environment comes with some really gruesome pictures of animals that have been abused, and they come forward, don't kid yourself, they don't. I've seen some of them, and it's horrible. If that's public, I'm going to think twice about going to this open forum and talking about the animal things that I've abused and want to appeal it. And get the people that are causing the problem to stop. And with the previous act we put forward on animal rights, it really has worked. It has worked. And there was some loopholes in the system that people got through. This is going to close those loopholes up, and it's going to make it better for companion animals in the province. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few words, I'd move third reading of Bill number 27, the Animal Protection Act.
Motion is for third reading of Bill number 27, the Animal Protection Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 27, an act to protect animals and to aid animals in distress.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 32, the Body Armour Control Act.
Now call Bill number 32, the Body Armour Control Act. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill 32, the Body Armour Control Act, be read a third time. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is intended to better protect the safety of police and the public in this province. Halifax Regional Police Superintendent Brenda Young addressed the Law Amendments Committee and spoke from experience on the risks associated with the use of unauthorized body armour. She told us that members of organized crime, specifically outlaw motorcycle gangs, use body armor or bullet and stab-proof vests to protect themselves in violent confrontations with police and with each other, and that the use of body armor makes them more brazen in the way they commit their crimes. This clearly paints a picture of the elevated risk posed to police, other peace officers, and the public at large. Mr. Speaker, this is troubling. The fact is that body armor is more readily available than it was intended to be. Yet without this legislation, there's no authority to seize the armor. Mr. Speaker, the intent of this legislation is to improve public safety and the safety of peace officers. I recognize that protective gear is used for certain activities, including some sports. This will not change. These uses are not affected by this legislation. There is protective sports equipment, and then there is body armor. This Act is very specific to body armor or bullet and stab-proof vests. Mr. Speaker, this legislation ensures that only those who legitimately need body armor due to the nature of their occupation or employment can use it. This includes police officers, sheriffs, corrections officers, special constables, provincial civil constables, conservation officers, bylaw enforcement officers, security guards, paramedics, and others. There are mechanisms, Mr. Speaker, built into this legislation to expand the list of occupations that can possess body armor if necessary. The legislation allows for those and other occupations to be added through regulations. Mr. Speaker, we've heard concerns about bailiffs during law amendments, and the fact is bailiffs who are serving civil processes can be included by applying for provincial civil constable appointment or status under the Police Services Act. This would allow them to possess body armor in the course of their duties and employment. Adopting this legislation, Mr. Speaker, is the responsible thing to do. It's just one more tool where we can use to make our streets and communities safer, Mr. Speaker. We've heard, Mr. Speaker, from the law enforcement community a request specifically from the President, past President now of the Nova Scotia Chiefs of Police Association. We've heard from individual police officers, Mr. Speaker. We believe this is a sound, reasonable, next step piece of legislation to provide enhanced safety to our law enforcement community and the public at large. With those comments, I look forward to comments of my colleagues.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to bring attention that I have had a few constituents come to me with concerns. They are sport shooters, and they want to be able to wear body armor. And I know our leader spoke to that at second reading, but I just wanted to emphasize and make those comments again for safety reasons. Mr. Speaker, thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We agree that this government does go some way to protecting public safety. We support the bill. As to the presenter about bailiffs, the presenter law amendments was in fact a provincial civil constable, but I think he was making a point about his staff. Now, presumably most of them could also apply for that designation. But he did, mention his office staff and just the danger of working in that particular area. So, as at second reading, I would just urge the minister and the government to look at perhaps a Bailiffs Act or adding some of those folks through the regulations just to ensure, everyone's safety in this regard. And the only other comment we'll make is, there are those people who do own body armor that will become illegal by the passage of this legislation. So we'd urge the government, and some presumably not for a nefarious purpose, but because it was available and they purchased it. So we'd urge the government to give them time to turn it over and to ensure that we do some good public education so that we can make sure that this law is coming into force is smooth. And with those few comments, I'll take my seat.
Trying to recognize the Honourable Minister of Justice. It will be to close third reading of Bill number 32, the Body Armour Control Act. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate the comments from my colleagues. One of the elements built into the legislation, Mr. Speaker, is in fact a waiver, so it extends police the opportunity to utilize discretion, and certainly in the early stages, Mr. Speaker, not so much an amnesty program as built into the legislation the ability to take possession of that for the very purposes my colleague has identified. And with those few comments, Mr. Speaker, I rise to close debate on Bill 32.
The motion is for third reading of Bill number 32, the Body Armor Control Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 32, an act respecting the control of body armor.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 38, the Residential Tenancies Act?
We'll now call Bill number 38, the Residential Tenancies Act. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 38, an act to amend Chapter 401 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Residential Tenancies Act, be now read for a third time and do pass. Mr. Speaker, our goal is to make the Act more inclusive, accessible and balanced for both tenants and landlords. The amendments are largely based on consultations with both tenants and landlord groups. The feedback helped inform our changes here today. Clear information and common understanding of the Act will benefit both landlords and tenants. Clarifying terms such as tenant and providing additional methods to serve documents such as electronically will help achieve these goals. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the following amendments will improve clarity and consistency in the Act and increase efficiency and balance for the parties involved. Number one, reducing the time for landlords to inventory and store abandoned property from 60 days to 30 days. Number two, currently home buyers who do not wish to be landlords may only make an application to evict the tenant after a home is purchased and in their possession. The changes will allow the seller to initiate the eviction upon proof of sale. Next, allowing tenants to give notice to change their yearly tenancy to month instead of asking for a landlord's permission. Next one, providing landlords with entry times to show an apartment to a prospective tenant or purchaser where there is a fixed term lease in place, and terminating a lease the next month after a single tenant dies to eliminate unnecessary financial hardship for family of the deceased. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of the direction we're taking with these amendments, and with those short remarks, I look forward to the comments opposite.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are pleased, with apologies to my colleague, we are pleased that the residential tenancies, that the government seems to have done some consultation with stakeholders in the development of this bill. The Residential Tenancies Act is one of, I think, the acts in Nova Scotia that really affects people in their daily lives. And it's important that we do work to ensure that that it works for Nova Scotians and that people are able to interact with the Residential Tenancies Board in a way that is practical and reasonable for them. In my comments, I simply wanted to make the point that it's particularly important that the Act adequately protect Nova Scotians living in low income and those who may find themselves in precarious housing situations. Unfortunately, the government has not yet brought forward anything in this session to help with the affordability of rental housing or to deal with significant increases in rent that are occurring, particularly in the capital region of Halifax. In the municipality, which I represent, and which about half the population of Nova Scotia now lives in, almost half of renter households are already spending more than 30% of their income on shelter. And what we haven't seen real significant investment in non-market housing in many years. There's been some promises made at the federal level in terms of the national housing strategy. Provincially, that has mostly translated into rent supplements, which structurally in the marketplace of housing don't address the long-term affordability of rental housing. For that, we would need to have an increase in non-market housing, so that would include investment in additional public housing, but also expansion of rent co-ops, potential development of land trusts. There are innovative proposals and innovative groups working towards more non-market housing, but the provincial government has, I'd say, been slow to follow that lead and certainly has not been leading. So again, it's encouraging that the government seems to have done some consultation with stakeholders in the development of this bill, and I guess my ask would be for additional work to proceed on this file. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia, will be to close third reading of Bill number 38, the Residential Tenancies Act. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member opposite for her comments. Certainly, with respect to this issue, it is one of those overarching issues with 300,000 total renters in the province. The relationship between landlords and tenants is a significant one, and I think it's incumbent on the government to strike that balance. And really, with this legislation, as always, there's more to do. But with respect to this one, in the consultation groups, there was 14 issues identified. 9 were agreed in lockstep on both sides, tenants and landlords. There was 2, namely the piece around inventory and the eviction upon proof of sale, whereby we had enough information to sort of make those changes and enshrine them in legislation. There were 3 other issues that were sort of long-term issues that really we didn't think we had enough agreement upon, and certainly we weren't ready to move those forward. So of the total 14 issues, some of the issues around rent control just weren't something that were brought up through those consultations. So we're certainly willing to work with both sides of this discussion. Now, we always have been, and one of the most encouraging pieces for both the tenant groups and for the landlord representatives was that this is an ongoing discussion, and I think this is a step in the right direction. There's always more to do, and the advocates on both sides are certainly eager to get in with the next round of consultations and make sure that we're reflecting the needs and establishing that fairness and balance on both sides. So certainly it's been a great process. I do appreciate the very important input that the consultations brought forward, the tremendous work that the Department of Service Nova Scotia did in making sure we were reflecting the needs and wishes and concerns of both sides, and I will certainly look to do more of that in the future. So I do again thank the member opposite, and with that I'd like to close third reading debate on Bill number 38, the Residential Tenancies Act. Thanks.
Motion is for third reading of Bill number 38, the Residential Tenancies Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 38, an act to amend Chapter 401 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Residential Tenancies Act.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 42, the Vital Statistics Act?
Now call Bill number 42, the Vital Statistics Act. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 42, an act to amend the Vital Statistics Act, be now read a third time and do pass. After extensive consultation with the 2SL LGBTIQ+ community, the following amendments were made to the Vital Statistics Act. X to be added as an option for gender identity in the sex indicator field on the Nova Scotia birth certificate for anyone who doesn't identify exclusively as male or female. You will also now be able to obtain a birth certificate that does not display the sex field or indicator, and there will still be the option for male and female on the certificate. The fee to change the sex indicator on the birth certificate will be waived at the same time these changes come into effect. In addition, we are removing the requirement for anyone 16 years of age or older to get a statement from a professional to change their sex indicator on their birth certificate. And we are providing an opportunity for Nova Scotia residents born outside the province to apply for a change of sex indicator. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to say that Nova Scotia is the first province in Canada to offer all of these services. It is a tremendous accomplishment and honour, and one that I'm so pleased to say has been receiving tremendously positive and widespread support here in Nova Scotia. Other amendments to the Vital Statistics Act include giving all parents the same rights to register the birth of their child with the surname of their choice, and providing Nova Scotians with the most secure and cost-effective access to online birth, marriage, and death certificates by creating the ability to restrict third-party vendors selling these services online. Mr. Speaker, I believe, and we all believe in what we are doing here. That's the right step in the good direction for our province. With those short remarks, I'll turn the floor over to my colleagues opposite.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to speak on this bill today in third reading. I want to echo the comments I've already made in second reading about this, that these are very important changes for the people that the changes affect directly, and also all of Nova Scotia. I believe that as a province, we need to move forward into an understanding of gender as a non-binary or as a fluid thing, and this will help, and it sends a message that we are respecting individuals' gender identity, and we recognize that we are moving away, and we should move away from understanding gender as a binary to a more fluid understanding of gender and gender identity. I wanted to tell a quick story. The minister alluded to the fact that now the bill, when it's passed, will allow anyone to choose the surnames of their children. Well, in fact, I think I broke the law already, because I chose the surnames of my children and I gave them their father's name, and I think that was not really allowed under the Act, but no one questioned me, so I just did it. So anyway, now I'm happy that my family will be in line with the laws. What? I'm not going to go to jail over that. But I also, hang on. I also wanted to tell a story about when I was pregnant with my first child. This is kind of a funny story that we think about now, but it actually speaks to this bill. And that is when we went for one of our ultrasounds, the technician wanted to know if we wanted to know the sex of our child. Now, of course, at that time, the technician used the word gender, and so my partner and I understood that we couldn't know the gender of our child, because the gender of our child will be told to us by that child when she is ready. And in fact, she might not be a she when she tells us, but so we didn't want to know. We didn't want to know if we were having a male or female baby. And then so the technician went ahead with the ultrasound, and at the end, the woman said to us, "Well, just so you know, her gender is normal." And I took a pause, and I was like, do you mean one or the other? And then she went, "Yes, her gender, or the gender is normal." And I was like, "Great, that's great to know." And we thought it was very funny, because we knew that what she meant was the sex of the baby was one sex, it had the anatomical parts of one sex or the other. We didn't know which one, but we knew that the gender would be normal, because everyone, in my opinion, gender is normal, but that we didn't know how our child would identify to us when that child was ready. And so since after that, my good friends would put their heads to my belly and go, "Your gender is normal," and whisper it to my child. So I think that she is ready to enter this new world where our province is leading in this understanding that gender is non-binary, or gender can be fluid. So I also want to say that I look forward to the fact that many of my constituents will be able to access ID now that is appropriate for them and their wish to identify their gender identity or their sex. And I'm really happy that we're about to pass this legislation. Thank you very much.
And recognize the Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia. It will be closed third reading of Bill number 42, the Vital Statistics Act. Would all those in favour, the Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to thank the member from Dartmouth North for her comments. our gender is normal. I think that pretty much sums it up. That's where we are this day and age, and I think that that's a pretty profound way to bring in the final comments around legislation like this. Mr. Speaker, lots of this is about the outdated terminology and language, but most of it is about just recognizing that people are people, and we've wasted too much time looking at differences in a negative way. These are easy things for governments to do, and I'm encouraged by this, and I look forward to more of this as time goes on. So with that, we'll close debate on Bill number 42. Thanks.
Motion is for third reading of Bill number 42, the Vital Statistics Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 42, an act to amend Chapter 494 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Vital Statistics Act.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 44, the Change of Name Act?
We'll now call Bill number 44, the Change of Name Act. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill 44, an act to amend the Change of Name Act, be now read a third time and do pass. The amendment we are making will reduce the residency period for a person not born in Nova Scotia to seek a legal change of name. We are going from 1 year to 3 months. Mr. Speaker, because a change of name sometimes accompanies or follows the change of name sex indicator, it is important that residency requirements for both applications are aligned. This will make it easier for applicants who seek both changes, as well as for those just seeking a legal change of name. And that pretty much sums it up. Thank you.
Motion is for third reading of Bill number 44, the Change of Name Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 44, entitled an act to amend Chapter 66 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Change of Name Act.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 45, the Senior Citizens Property Tax Rebate Act?
We'll now call Bill number 45, the Senior Citizens Property Tax Rebate Act. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 45, an act respecting property tax rebates to senior citizens, be now read for a third time and do pass. Mr. Speaker, simply put, this will help some low-income seniors in Nova Scotia. The property tax rebate program provides eligible homeowners with a 50% rebate on actual residential municipal property taxes paid during the previous tax year to a maximum of $800. Mr. Speaker, the amendments I brought forward will extend the eligibility criteria for the property tax rebate for seniors program to allow a rebate to be issued when the Nova Scotia senior moves out of their primary residence but has paid the previous year's municipal taxes. The change in eligibility criteria could allow up to 150 additional Nova Scotia senior households to qualify for a rebate. And with that, I'll pass the floor over to my colleagues opposite.
Motion is for third reading of Bill number 45, the Senior Citizens Property Tax Rebate Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 45, entitled an act respecting property tax rebates to senior citizens.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 48, various statutes administered by Service Nova Scotia?
We'll now call Bill number 48, an act to amend various statutes administered by Service Nova Scotia. The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 48 be read for a third time and do pass. Mr. Speaker, the amendments being made to various Service Nova Scotia Acts will streamline processes and clarify and strengthen language and the purpose of the law. They will also support our work to modernize legislation and streamline those regulations to support government's commitment to making programs and services more accessible and more efficient for Nova Scotians. Regarding the Marriage Act, the Deputy Registrar General will now have increased enforcement responsibility to terminate a cleric's and a religious body's registration to solemnize marriages if they are not adhering to their own requirements. These could include stated beliefs, who can conduct marriage services, and the marriage rites to be followed, or failing to comply with the Act. Mr. Speaker, we are also amending various Service Nova Scotia Acts, which include updating and harmonizing limitation periods at 3 years to make the Collections Agencies Act, Consumer Creditors Conduct Act, Consumer Protection Act, Consumer Reporting Act, Direct Sellers Regulation Act, and the Mortgage Regulation Act consistent. This means if someone is in violation of the Act, you have 3 years to charge that person. Updating and correcting language in the Consumer Protection Act, Petroleum Products Pricing Act, and the Consumer Reporting Act. For example, gender terms like his and workmanlike will be removed, and also correcting typographical errors in the Direct Sellers Regulation Act. We will also be clarifying and enhancing regulatory and regulation-making authority in the Consumer Protection Act and the Consumer Reporting Act. This includes allowing the registrar to set new application form requirements. And finally, updating and repealing reference to courts and programs that no longer exist in the Moneylenders Act and the Unconscionable Transactions Relief Act. This includes removing references to county court and the appeal division. Mr. Speaker, it's simply important that our laws reflect today's society, and these amendments do just that. Thank you.
The motion is for third reading of Bill number 48, an act to amend various statutes administered by Service Nova Scotia. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 48, entitled an act to amend various statutes administered by Service Nova Scotia.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before we discuss tomorrow's House business, I would like to request a quick recess for the House leaders to discuss some of the mechanics around the agenda for tomorrow.
House will now recess for a few minutes.
Three wise men is up to something. Quite the deal.
Order, please. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That concludes government business for today. I move that the House do now rise to meet again tomorrow, Wednesday, October 3rd, between the hours of 1 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. Following daily routine and question period is, of course, Opposition Day. So I will now turn it over to the Opposition House Leader for business for tomorrow.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Deputy Government House Leader. Tomorrow, after the daily routine and question period, we'll be calling Bill 47, which is the Cancer Survivors Day Act, and also Bill 71, the Pressure Sore Accountability Act. And I'll move that we do now rise to meet again tomorrow between the hours of 1 and 5:30.
Motion is for the House to adjourn to rise again tomorrow, Wednesday, October 3rd, between the hours of 1 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The House now stands adjourned until tomorrow at 1 p.m.